Welcome, weary seeker of magical knowledge, to a gentle journey through the mystical art of prophecy in the wizarding world. Tonight we shall drift through the ethereal realm where future meets present, where the threads of destiny are woven by those blessed or perhaps cursed with the inner eye. From the misty towers of Hogwarts to the sacred halls of ancient seers, let these whispered visions carry you into peaceful slumber. Close your eyes and allow the soft voices of prophecy to guide you through tales of predetermined fate, chosen ones, and the delicate magic that binds tomorrow to today. In the shadowed corridors of magical history, where time itself bends beneath the weight of accumulated wisdom, there exists an art so ancient and mysterious that even the greatest wizards speak of it only in hushed whispers. The practice of prophecy stretches back beyond recorded memory, to the earliest days when magic first awakened in human consciousness, and the boundary between present and future was as thin as morning mist over a sacred grove. Long before Hogwarts rose from Scottish stone, before the Ministry of Magic governed magical Britain, before even the oldest pure-blood families could trace their lineages, there lived those blessed, or perhaps cursed, with the ability to glimpse what lay beyond the veil of tomorrow. These were the first seers, individuals whose magical cores resonated with temporal frequencies that ordinary wizards could never perceive, whose consciousness could slip momentarily free from the constraints of linear time, to witness events that had not yet come to pass. The distinction between a true seer and a mere fortune teller is as vast as the chasm between authentic magic and clever parlor tricks. A fortune teller reads cards, interprets crystal balls through learned symbolism, and offers guidance based on intuition and educated guesswork. Their craft, while sometimes surprisingly accurate, remains grounded in the realm of probability and human psychology. A true seer, however, experiences something far more profound and terrible, a complete surrender of conscious control, as their mind becomes a conduit for knowledge that flows backward through time itself. When prophecy strikes, it comes like lightning splitting a clear sky. The seer's normal personality vanishes, replaced by something ancient and otherworldly. Their voice changes, often becoming harsh or hoarse, speaking with cadences that belong to no earthly dialect. Their eyes may roll back, showing only white, while their body trembles with the effort of containing forces that were never meant to inhabit mortal flesh. Most disturbing of all, when the vision ends, they remember nothing of what they have spoken, awakening as if from a brief but exhausting sleep, unaware that they have just altered the course of history. The ancient magical civilizations understood the terrible gift of prophecy better than the modern world ever has. In the lost kingdoms of Atlantis and Lemuria, whose magical achievements remain unmatched even today, seers were revered as living bridges between the mortal realm and the cosmic forces that shape destiny itself. These civilizations built great temples around their oracles, understanding that prophecy was not merely individual talent, but a manifestation of magic's deepest mysteries, the intersection of consciousness with the fundamental structure of reality. The Egyptians, whose magical traditions would later influence every major wizarding culture, developed elaborate rituals to protect their seers from the psychological damage that prophetic visions inevitably caused. They discovered that the human mind, no matter how magically gifted, was not designed to contain knowledge of future events. The weight of seeing tomorrow's tragedies, of knowing which paths led to triumph and which to disaster, crushed many seers beneath burdens too heavy for mortal souls to bear. The Egyptian solution was to create magical vessels, early versions of what would later become prophecy orbs that could contain the visions while protecting the seer from remembering their own words. In ancient Greece, the oracle at Delphi became perhaps the most famous prophetic institution in magical history. though Muggle legends barely hint at the true extent of her abilities. The Pythia, as she was known, would enter her prophetic trances in a chamber filled with magical vapors that rose from deep within the earth, gases that enhanced her natural seer abilities while gradually destroying her physical form. Her prophecies shaped the rise and fall of empires, guided the decisions of kings and heroes, and demonstrated the terrible price that true foresight demanded from those who possessed it. The Celtic Druids approached prophecy differently, understanding it as part of the natural cycle that governed all magical life. They recognized that time itself was not the linear progression that non-magical minds perceived, but a great spiral where past, present, and future existed simultaneously, separated only by the limitations of ordinary consciousness. Their seers learned to move along this spiral with practiced ease, though they paid for their abilities with shortened lives and minds that gradually became untethered from the present moment. In the Far East, Chinese magical scholars developed theories about prophetic magic that would not be matched for sophistication until the modern era. They understood that prophecy was intimately connected to the flow of magical energy through the earth itself, following ley lines and gathering strength at points where multiple streams of power converged. Their seers were trained not just to receive visions, but to interpret them within the context of cosmic harmony, understanding that individual prophecies were merely notes in a vast symphony of fate that encompassed all living things. The role of celestial bodies in prophetic magic cannot be understated, though their influence operates through mechanisms that even contemporary magical theory struggles to explain. The movement of planets and stars creates patterns in the magical field that surrounds our world, patterns that sensitive individuals can perceive as glimpses of future possibility. The ancient wizards mapped these patterns with obsessive precision, creating charts and calculations that allowed them to predict when prophetic visions were most likely to occur and what cosmic forces might influence their content. The moon, with its powerful connection to magical tides, plays a particularly crucial role in prophetic magic. Seers throughout history have reported that their most powerful visions come during specific lunar phases, when the satellite's gravitational influence aligns with magical currents in ways that temporarily thin the barriers between temporal dimensions. The full moon amplifies all magical abilities, but it also makes prophetic visions more violent and difficult to control. Many seers learn to avoid attempting prophecy during full moon periods, understanding that the enhanced power comes with proportionally increased risk. The process by which prophecies are received varies among individuals, but certain commonalities persist across all recorded cases. The initial trigger often comes without warning, a sudden disconnection from ordinary consciousness that leaves the seer's body functioning on magical autopilot, while their awareness travels along pathways of possibility that exist outside normal space-time. During this state, they become conduits for information that flows backward from potential futures, their vocal cords and magical cores working in harmony to translate cosmic knowledge into human language. The physical toll of prophecy is severe and cumulative. Each vision ages the seer beyond their chronological years, as if the effort of containing future knowledge accelerates the natural processes of mental and physical decay. Their magical cores, strained by channeling forces they were never designed to handle, often develop irregularities that affect their ability to perform ordinary spells. Most troubling of all, repeated prophetic experiences gradually erode the barrier between present and future consciousness, leaving seers increasingly disconnected from the reality that surrounds them in favor of visions that may never come to pass. The recording and preservation of prophecies presents unique magical challenges that have occupied scholars for centuries. Unlike ordinary magical knowledge, which can be stored in books or teaching crystals, prophetic visions resist conventional preservation methods. They exist in a state of temporal flux, their meaning and power shifting as the events they describe move from distant possibility to immediate reality. The development of prophecy orbs those delicate spheres of spun glass that capture and contain prophetic utterances, represents one of the greatest achievements in applied magical theory, requiring techniques that must account for the temporal instability inherent in all future knowledge. Throughout recorded history, certain prophecies have shaped the course of wizarding civilization in ways both obvious and subtle. The great prophecy of Merlin, spoken in the dying days of Camelot, predicted the eventual establishment of formal magical education and the rise of institutions like Hogwarts School. The vision of Baba Yaga foretold the great wizard migrations that would spread magical knowledge from Europe to the New World. The Oracle of Babylon spoke of a time when magical and non-magical populations would live in complete separation, a prediction that would eventually influence the development of the International Statute of Secrecy. Perhaps most significantly, the medieval seer, known only as the Hermit of Whitmore, prophesied the coming of Dark Lords, whose power would threaten the very foundations of magical society. His visions, recorded in fragmentary manuscripts that survive in the deepest vaults of magical libraries, speak of cyclical darkness that would rise and fall across the centuries, each manifestation more terrible than the last. Scholars who have studied these ancient texts believe they may contain references to Grindelwald, Voldemort, and other dark wizards whose names have been lost to time but whose shadows stretched across generations. The question of free will versus destiny lies at the heart of all prophetic magic, a philosophical puzzle that has tormented magical thinkers for millennia. If the future can be glimpsed, does that mean it is predetermined? Do prophecies describe inevitable outcomes, or merely possibilities that might be avoided through different choices? The evidence suggests a complex relationship between fate and freedom, where prophecies create probability cascades that make certain outcomes more likely, while never eliminating the possibility of alternative futures. Some magical philosophers argue that prophecy actually creates the future it describes, that the act of speaking prophetic words alters the flow of magical energy in ways that make the predicted events more probable. This theory suggests that seers are not passive observers of tomorrow, but active participants in its creation, their visions serving as catalysts that transform possibility into reality. If true, this would make the gift of prophecy far more dangerous than even most seers realize, turning every vision into a potential act of magical manipulation on a cosmic scale. The connection between prophecy and magical energy follows patterns that suggest deep structural relationships between consciousness, time, and the fundamental forces that govern reality itself. Prophecies tend to cluster around individuals or events that possess unusual magical significance, as if the universe itself recognizes certain moments as crucial pivot points where small actions might have enormous consequences. This explains why so many prophecies center on chosen ones, dark lords, or world-changing events. These represent nodes in the web of causality, where the normal rules of probability break down and extraordinary possibilities become manifest. The study of temporal mechanics in magical theory has revealed that time itself possesses a kind of consciousness, an awareness that guides the flow of events towards certain outcomes while preserving the illusion of free choice. Prophecies may represent moments when this temporal consciousness briefly touches human awareness, sharing glimpses of the patterns it perceives across vast spans of past and future time. If accurate, this theory would suggest that seers are not receiving visions from their own enhanced abilities, but serving as temporary vessels for a form of consciousness that exists beyond individual identity. The magical traditions surrounding prophecy have evolved differently in various cultures, but all share certain fundamental recognitions about the nature of time and fate. The shamanic traditions of the Americas understand prophecy as communication with ancestral spirits who exist outside temporal boundaries and can therefore perceive all moments simultaneously. African magical cultures view prophetic visions as messages from the collective, unconscious of all living things, a shared pool of knowledge that transcends individual experience. These different interpretations suggest that prophecy may be a universal phenomenon that manifests through whatever conceptual framework the seer's culture provides. As magical society has modernized, the role of prophecy has become increasingly controversial. The establishment of the Ministry of Magic and similar governing bodies around the world has brought bureaucratic approaches to managing prophetic knowledge, treating visions as state resources that must be controlled and regulated rather than sacred communications that deserve reverence. This shift has fundamentally altered the relationship between seers and their gifts, turning many prophetic individuals into reluctant servants of institutional power rather than independent conduits for cosmic wisdom. The development of the Department of Mysteries represents both the pinnacle of organized approach to prophetic study and a tragic misunderstanding of prophecy's true nature. By treating visions as collectible objects that can be catalogued and stored like any other magical artifact, the Ministry has reduced one of magic's most profound mysteries to mere bureaucratic procedure. The Hall of Prophecy, for all its impressive architecture and careful security measures, represents a fundamentally mechanistic approach to forces that operate beyond any human institution's ability to truly comprehend or control. Modern magical education has similarly struggled to address the reality of prophetic ability. Divination classes at schools like Hogwarts focus primarily on interpretive techniques and symbolic systems, rather than attempting to identify or train students who might possess genuine seer abilities. This approach reflects both practical concerns about the dangers of prophetic training and deeper philosophical uncertainty about whether true prophecy can be taught or merely recognized when it manifests naturally. The psychological support systems available to modern seers remain woefully inadequate, reflecting centuries of misunderstanding about the mental health consequences of prophetic ability. Unlike other forms of magical talent, which generally enhance their possessor's quality of life, the gift of prophecy invariably extracts a terrible price in psychological stability and social connection. Seers often become isolated figures, unable to form normal relationships when they can perceive the eventual outcomes of every interaction, burdened with knowledge that they cannot share and cannot forget. The ethics of prophetic knowledge present dilemmas that have no clear solutions. Should seers be required to report their visions to governmental authorities? Do they have moral obligations to warn people about disasters they have foreseen? What responsibility do they bear for the consequences of their prophecies, both intended and unintended? These questions become particularly acute when prophecies involve matters of life and death, where the decision to share or withhold information could determine whether people live or die. The relationship between prophecy and other forms of magical ability remains one of the least understood aspects of magical theory. Some seers possess no other notable magical talents, as if prophecy has consumed all their mystical potential. Others demonstrate abilities that seem to complement their prophetic gifts: enhanced empathy, unusual skill with protective charms, or mysterious connections to magical creatures that can sense temporal disturbances. These patterns suggest that prophecy may not be a standalone ability, but part of a larger syndrome of magical characteristics that orient their possessors toward perceiving and manipulating the flow of time itself. The influence of prophecy on magical culture extends far beyond the specific predictions that prove accurate. The mere existence of seers and their visions has shaped how magical society understands concepts of fate, responsibility, and the nature of time itself. Wizarding culture's acceptance of prophecy as genuine phenomenon has created philosophical frameworks that emphasize destiny and predetermined patterns in ways that profoundly influence how magical people make decisions and interpret events in their own lives. As we drift deeper into the realm of prophetic mysteries, let the ancient wisdom of seers long past guide your thoughts toward peaceful contemplation of tomorrow's infinite possibilities, where every choice creates new pathways through time, and every moment holds the potential for prophecies yet to be spoken by voices that have not yet learned to listen to destiny's whispered secrets. In the misty highlands of Scotland, where ancient magic flows through granite veins and whispers through heather-covered hills, there stands a weathered gravestone bearing a name that has echoed through the corridors of prophetic history for over 3 centuries. Cassandra Trelawney, the most renowned seer of her generation, lies beneath that simple marker, though her influence on the magical world extends far beyond the confines of her final resting place. Her legacy lives on in bloodlines and prophecies, in the trembling voices of descendants who inherited both her gift and her burden, carrying forward a tradition of sight that pierces the veil between present and future with devastating clarity. The story of the Trelawney family begins not with Cassandra herself, but with her great-grandmother, Morwen Trelawney, a Welsh witch whose prophetic abilities first manifested during the great magical upheavals of the 16th century. Morwen's visions came to her in dreams that were so vivid and disturbing that she would wake screaming, her nightgowns soaked with perspiration, and her eyes reflecting terrors that belonged to futures yet unborn. She spoke of plagues that would ravage both magical and muggle populations, of wars that would reshape the boundaries between nations, and of a great statute that would forever separate the magical world from the mundane. Morwen's prophecies were recorded by her daughter Rhiannon, who possessed no seer abilities herself but understood the importance of preserving her mother's visions for future generations. Rhiannon developed a system of magical notation that could capture not just the words of prophecy but something of their emotional resonance, their temporal weight, and the cosmic significance that distinguished true prophecy from mere prediction. These techniques would be passed down through the female line of the family, creating a tradition of prophetic scholarship that was as important as the gift of sight itself. The burden of prophetic ability skipped Rhiannon entirely, manifesting instead in her daughter, Bronwen Trelawney, whose visions were even more powerful and destructive than those of her grandmother. Bronwen's prophecies came not in dreams but during her waking hours, striking without warning and leaving her collapsed and trembling in their aftermath. She foresaw the rise of the International Confederation of Wizards, the establishment of magical schools across Europe, and the coming of dark wizards whose names would be whispered in fear for generations to come. Bronwen's most famous prophecy, spoken when she was barely 20 years old, described a time when the serpent shall rise from the ashes of nobility, and magic itself shall be twisted into shapes that nature never intended. Magical historians now believe this was a reference to the eventual rise of Voldemort, whose pure-blood fanaticism and creation of Horcruxes represented exactly the kind of magical perversion that Bronwen had foreseen. The prophecy was recorded in multiple copies and distributed throughout the magical world, though few understood its true significance until centuries later when its words proved terrifyingly accurate. The prophetic gift continued to manifest in alternating generations, following patterns that the family learned to recognize and fear. Each seer in the Trelawney line was more powerful than the last, as if the genetic potential for prophecy was accumulating over time, building towards some ultimate expression that would either elevate the family to unprecedented significance or destroy them entirely. The women who inherited the gift invariably suffered for it, their minds gradually fragmenting under the weight of visions that human consciousness was never meant to contain. Cassandra Trelawney represented the culmination of this hereditary progression, born into the world during a conjunction of planets that ancient magical astronomy recognized as particularly favorable to prophetic development. From her earliest childhood, it was clear that she possessed abilities that surpassed even her most gifted ancestors. Where previous Trelawney seers had experienced visions as discrete events, Cassandra lived in a state of perpetual temporal awareness, her consciousness existing simultaneously in multiple time streams that allowed her to perceive past, present, and future as interconnected aspects of a single, vast pattern. Her childhood was marked by incidents that terrified her parents and convinced them that their daughter was touched by forces beyond their understanding or control. She would speak to people who were not there, carrying on detailed conversations with individuals who would not be born for decades. She drew pictures of places she had never seen, architectural details so precise that they could later be matched to buildings that would be constructed years after her death. Most disturbing of all, she would sometimes weep inconsolably for tragedies that had not yet occurred, mourning losses that existed only in the realm of prophetic possibility. The formal recognition of Cassandra's abilities came during her 7th year, when she experienced her first true prophetic trance while attending a family gathering. In front of dozens of witnesses, including several prominent members of the Wizengamot, she spoke in the harsh, otherworldly voice that marked genuine prophecy, describing a great war that would engulf the magical world and a dark wizard whose power would threaten the very foundations of civilized society. The prophecy was recorded in its entirety and sealed in the family archives, though portions of it would later be shared with magical authorities who understood its significance. As Cassandra matured, her abilities continued to develop in ways that both amazed and horrified those who witnessed them. She could enter prophetic trances at will, though doing so exacted a terrible price in physical and mental exhaustion. Her visions became more detailed and specific, offering glimpses of future events with accuracy that approached perfect foresight. Political leaders sought her counsel, understanding that her predictions could influence the rise and fall of governments, the outcomes of wars, and the fate of entire civilizations. But the gift that made Cassandra invaluable to the magical world was slowly destroying her as an individual. The constant exposure to future knowledge created a form of temporal displacement that gradually separated her from the present moment. She began to speak of current events as if they were memories from the distant past, while treating her own prophetic visions as immediate realities that required her urgent attention. Her family watched helplessly as she became increasingly detached from ordinary human concerns, her consciousness sliding along pathways of time that led ever further from the world that surrounded her physical form. The most significant of Cassandra's prophecies was spoken during the winter of 1693, when she was 32 years old, and already showing signs of the mental deterioration that would eventually claim her sanity entirely. The prophecy, known to scholars as the Great Vision of Cassandra, described a series of events that would unfold over the course of several centuries, culminating in a final confrontation between the forces of light and darkness that would determine the future of magical civilization itself. The Great Vision spoke of a child who would be born when the 7th month dies, marked by a Dark Lord as his equal but possessing power that the Dark Lord could not understand. It described a war that would test the courage of an entire generation, where victory would come not through superior magic or military might, but through the willing sacrifice of those who chose love over power. Most remarkably, It specifically mentioned the role that Cassandra's own descendant would play in these events, though it spoke of this future Trelawney seer in terms so cryptic that their meaning would not be understood until centuries later. The prophecy was recorded in multiple forms: written transcripts, magical memory extractions, and even artistic interpretations that attempted to capture the visual imagery that accompanied Cassandra's words. These various versions were distributed throughout the magical world, copies finding their way into the private collections of noble families, the archives of magical institutions, and the secret libraries maintained by those who understood the strategic value of prophetic knowledge. The prophecy became one of the most studied and debated documents in magical history, its implications analyzed by generations of scholars who struggled to understand its full significance. Cassandra's later years were marked by increasing isolation as her gift consumed what remained of her connection to ordinary reality. She spent her days in a tower room of the family estate, surrounded by charts and calculations that attempted to map the flow of time itself. Her conversations became increasingly incoherent to those who lacked prophetic abilities, filled with references to events that would not occur for decades and people who existed only in the realm of future possibility. Yet even in her madness, she continued to produce prophecies of startling accuracy, her damaged mind serving as a conduit for cosmic knowledge that transcended individual consciousness. The family records from this period describe a woman who had become more oracle than human, her physical form serving as a vessel for forces that operated on scales too vast for mortal comprehension. She would speak for hours about the intricate connections between seemingly unrelated events, describing how a decision made in one century could influence the outcome of battles fought generations later. Her relatives learned to record everything she said, understanding that even her most apparently nonsensical utterances might contain prophetic insights that would prove valuable to future generations. Cassandra's death in 1704 marked the end of an era in prophetic history. Her passing was preceded by a final burst of visionary activity that produced more than a dozen prophecies in the span of a single week, each one focused on events that would occur in the centuries following her death. Among these final visions was a detailed description of Hogwarts' School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, including architectural features and magical protections that would not be implemented until decades after her passing. She also spoke of a great library that would be built to house prophetic knowledge, and of descendant who would teach divination to students who carried the fate of the wizarding world in their young hands. The immediate aftermath of Cassandra's death was marked by intense scholarly activity, as magical researchers attempted to catalogue and analyze the enormous body of prophetic material she had produced. Her prophecies filled dozens of volumes, their contents ranging from specific predictions about individual lives to vast cosmic visions that encompassed the destiny of magical civilization itself. The task of interpretation was complicated by the temporal displacement that had characterized her later visions, making it difficult to determine which prophecies referred to immediate future events and which described possibilities that might not manifest for centuries. The preservation of Cassandra's prophetic legacy became a sacred duty for the Trelawney family, who understood that they were the guardians of knowledge that could influence the course of history itself. They developed elaborate systems for maintaining and protecting the prophecy archives, including magical safeguards that would prevent unauthorized access, while ensuring that the visions would remain available to those who might need them in times of crisis. These preservation techniques were themselves innovations in magical theory, requiring spells that could account for the temporal instability inherent in all prophetic knowledge. The influence of Cassandra's prophecies on subsequent magical history cannot be overstated. Political leaders consulted her visions when making decisions about war and peace. Educational reformers used her descriptions of future magical schools to guide the development of curricula and teaching methods. Even the founders of Hogwarts are known to have studied her prophecies extensively, incorporating many of her suggested magical protections into the castle's design, and surrounding their new school with defenses that reflected centuries of prophetic wisdom about the threats it would eventually face. The genetic legacy that Cassandra passed to her descendants was as significant as her prophetic writings, though it would not fully manifest until several generations later. The power that had burned so brightly in her was too intense to be sustained by ordinary human physiology, and it lay dormant in her children and grandchildren, waiting for the proper combination of circumstances and hereditary factors to reawaken. This dormancy was perhaps a mercy, as it allowed the family to recover from the trauma of watching their most gifted member slowly consumed by her own abilities. The burden of carrying Cassandra's legacy fell most heavily on the women of the family, who were expected to study her prophecies and prepare themselves for the possibility that the gift might manifest in their own children. These preparations included not just academic study of prophetic theory, but psychological conditioning designed to help them cope with the unique stresses that would accompany the return of true seer abilities to the family line. They learned meditation techniques that could help maintain mental stability during prophetic episodes, protective charms that could shield their minds from the more destructive aspects of temporal displacement, and communication methods that would allow them to record visions even while in the grip of prophetic trance. The family's relationship with other notable seer bloodlines became increasingly important as the generations passed. The Trelawneys formed alliances with the Bones family, whose prophetic abilities manifested differently but complemented the Trelawney gift in significant ways. They also maintained connections with the continental seer families, particularly the French Delacours and the Germanic von Reich, whose ancestral visions had often intersected with Cassandra's prophecies in ways that suggested deep, structural connections between different prophetic traditions. These interfamily relationships served multiple purposes beyond simple social connection. By comparing the visions received by different seer bloodlines, the families could often identify patterns and correspondences that provided greater clarity about future events than any single prophetic tradition could achieve alone. They developed sophisticated theoretical frameworks for understanding how individual prophecies related to larger patterns of historical development, creating a kind of prophetic science that approached the complexity of advanced magical theory. The evolution of prophetic ability through the Trelawney bloodline followed patterns that reflected both genetic inheritance and the influence of accumulated magical knowledge passed down through family traditions. Each generation that carried the dormant gift was slightly more capable of channeling prophetic energy than their predecessors, as if the family's magical core was slowly adapting to handle the unique stresses that seer abilities imposed. This gradual strengthening ensured that when the gift finally reawakened, it would manifest in someone capable of surviving the experience long enough to make meaningful contributions to the prophetic tradition. The careful preservation of Cassandra's memory within family culture ensured that her influence extended far beyond her recorded prophecies. Stories about her life and abilities were passed down through oral tradition, creating a rich mythology that shaped how subsequent generations understood both the privileges and responsibilities that accompanied the prophetic gift. Children born into the family grew up hearing tales of their legendary ancestor, understanding from an early age that they might be called upon to carry forward a tradition that was both glorious and terrible in its implications. The weight of expectation that this legacy created was enormous, particularly for those family members who showed early signs of unusual magical ability. Every bout of childhood fever that produced vivid dreams was scrutinized for prophetic content. Every instance of seemingly prescient insight was carefully documented and analysed. The family developed elaborate testing procedures designed to identify the return of true seer abilities as early as possible, understanding that early recognition and proper training might be the difference between a functional prophet and someone whose mind would be shattered by forces they could not control. The academic study of Cassandra's prophecies became a specialized field within magical scholarship, with entire careers devoted to interpreting and analyzing her visions. Universities across the magical world established chairs in Trelawney studies and learned journals, published thousands of articles, attempting to decode the more obscure aspects of her prophetic utterances. This scholarly attention ensured that Cassandra's influence on magical thought remained strong even centuries after her death, her ideas continuing to shape how educated wizards understood the relationship between prophecy and historical causation. The international recognition of Cassandra's significance led to diplomatic efforts to ensure that copies of her prophecies would be preserved in multiple locations around the magical world. The French Ministry of Magic negotiated for access to certain visions that seemed to relate to continental European affairs. The American magical authorities requested copies of prophecies that might influence the development of magical communities in the New World. These international exchanges created a global network of prophetic scholarship that reflected the universal recognition of Cassandra's importance to magical civilization. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th and the 19th to the 20th, the Trelawney family continued to guard their ancestral legacy while watching for signs that the prophetic gift might be ready to manifest again. The bloodline had spread throughout the British Isles and beyond, creating multiple branches of the family tree that each carried the potential for prophetic awakening. The family maintained detailed genealogical records that tracked not just bloodline descent, but the inheritance of magical characteristics that might indicate readiness for prophetic development. The approach of the 20th century brought with it a sense of anticipation that had been building within the family for generations. Several of Cassandra's prophecies had specifically referenced this time period, suggesting that events of cosmic significance were approaching, and that the Trelawney gift would be needed again to help navigate the challenges that lay ahead. Family members began experiencing dreams and visions that, while not true prophecies, suggested that the long dormancy was coming to an end, and that someone among their number would soon inherit the full weight of their ancestral calling. The signs became unmistakable with the birth of Sybil Trelawney in 1960, a child whose arrival was accompanied by portents and omens that the family had been expecting for generations. The night of her birth, every piece of crystal in the Trelawney ancestral home began to resonate with harmonic frequencies that had not been heard since Cassandra's death. Ancient family portraits showed unusual activity, their painted subjects pointing toward the nursery where the newest Trelawney lay sleeping in her cradle, apparently aware that something momentous had just occurred. From her earliest infancy, Sybil displayed characteristics that marked her as the heir to Cassandra's legacy. She would stare fixedly at empty spaces as if seeing people who were not there, her infant eyes tracking movements that no one else could perceive. Her first words came unusually late, but when she finally began to speak, it was often in languages that no one in the household recognized, ancient dialects that seemed to emerge from some deeper source than normal childhood language acquisition. Most remarkably, she showed an instinctive understanding of time that went far beyond normal developmental patterns, referring to past events as if they were current and speaking of future possibilities with the casual certainty that other children reserved for immediate experiences. The family recognized that they were witnessing the return of the prophetic gift after nearly 3 centuries of dormancy, and they began the careful process of nurturing and protecting Sybil's developing abilities. This involved not just magical education, but psychological preparation for the unique stresses that would accompany the full flowering of her seer powers. They taught her meditation techniques that Cassandra had developed, protective charms that might shield her mind during prophetic episodes, and most importantly, they helped her understand that she was part of a tradition that stretched back through generations of women who had sacrificed their own peace of mind for the greater good of the magical world. As Sybil grew toward adulthood, the weight of her inheritance became increasingly apparent. She struggled with the knowledge that she was expected to continue a prophetic tradition that had destroyed every woman who had carried it before her, understanding that her gift was both a sacred trust and a form of genetic curse that would inevitably claim her sanity, if not her life. Yet she also felt the stirring of abilities that went beyond anything ordinary magical education could explain, visions and insights that seemed to flow from sources deeper than individual consciousness and more ancient than recorded history. The stage was set for prophecies that would reshape the wizarding world, spoken by a descendant who carried within her blood the accumulated wisdom and suffering of generations, ready to take her place in the long line of Trelawney seers who had glimpsed tomorrow's secrets and paid the ultimate price for their forbidden knowledge. The autumn rain fell heavily on the cobblestones of Hogsmeade village as Albus Dumbledore made his way through the narrow streets toward the Hog's Head Inn, his robes billowing around him like the wings of some great phoenix seeking shelter from the storm. The year was 1979, and the wizarding world was already showing signs of the darkness that would soon engulf it entirely. Mysterious disappearances had begun to trouble the ministry. Pure-blood families whispered of a rising power that promised to restore their ancient privileges, and those with the gift of foresight spoke in hushed voices of terrible visions that haunted their dreams. Dumbledore's purpose that evening was mundane by the standards of his usual responsibilities. A simple job interview with a candidate for the position of divination professor at Hogwarts School. The previous instructor had departed rather suddenly, claiming that the castle's ancient stones were interfering with her ability to read the future clearly, though those who knew her well suspected that her visions had simply become too frightening to bear. Finding a replacement had proven surprisingly difficult, as qualified divination teachers were rare, and those with genuine prophetic abilities were often too unstable for classroom instruction. The candidate he had arranged to meet was Sybil Patricia Trelawney, a young woman whose family name carried weight in certain scholarly circles, but whose personal qualifications remained largely untested. Her letter of application had been brief and somewhat confused, written in the elaborate script that many self-proclaimed seers affected, but containing none of the obvious charlatanism that marked most such correspondence. More intriguingly, her genealogy traced back to Cassandra Trelawney, the most famous prophetic voice of the 17th century, though family connection alone was hardly guarantee of inherited ability. The Hog's Head Inn stood at the end of a particularly disreputable street, its weathered facade and grimy windows suggesting the kind of establishment that catered to those who preferred to conduct their business away from the scrutiny of more respectable venues. The proprietor, Aberforth Dumbledore, had inherited both the inn and a talent for discretion from their father, making it an ideal location for conversations that required privacy from ministry officials and other interested parties. Albus had often used the inn for meetings that demanded absolute confidentiality, understanding that his brother's establishment offered protections that even Hogwarts could not guarantee. The interior of the inn was dimly lit and thick with smoke from pipes and poorly maintained magical fires, creating an atmosphere that seemed to muffle both sound and magical energy. A few patrons huddled over their drinks at scattered tables, their conversations conducted in the kind of whispers that suggested business dealings better left unexamined by authorities. Aberforth nodded toward a narrow staircase that led to the upper floors, his gruff expression indicating that Dumbledore's expected guest had already arrived and was waiting in one of the private rooms that the inn maintained for such purposes. The room Dumbledore entered was spartanly furnished but clean, containing only a small table, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out over the village's rooftops toward the distant silhouette of Hogwarts Castle. Sybil Trelawney rose to greet him as he entered, and his first impression was of someone who was trying perhaps too hard to embody the popular image of what a seer should be. Her clothing was layered with shawls and scarves in patterns that seemed calculated to suggest mystical knowledge, while her jewelry consisted largely of crystals and amulets that clinked softly with her movements. Yet beneath the theatrical presentation, Dumbledore's experienced eye detected something more substantial. Her magical aura carried undertones that he recognized from his studies of genuine prophetic ability, a particular quality of temporal displacement that marked those whose consciousness could slip free from the constraints of linear time. Her eyes, magnified by the large spectacles she wore, held depths that suggested experiences beyond her apparent age, as if she had already witnessed sorrows and triumphs that belonged to futures yet unborn. The interview began conventionally enough, with Dumbledore asking about her educational background and previous experience with divination instruction. Sybil's responses revealed a solid grounding in the theoretical aspects of prophetic magic, though her practical experience was limited to private study and occasional consultations for wealthy clients who sought guidance about personal matters. She spoke knowledgeably about the various forms of divination, crystal gazing, tea leaf reading, palmistry, and astrology, but her manner suggested that she regarded these as mere tools rather than sources of genuine insight. As their conversation continued, Dumbledore found himself growing increasingly skeptical about Sybil's suitability for the position he was seeking to fill. While she clearly possessed substantial knowledge about divination theory and showed genuine enthusiasm for the subject, there was little evidence that she possessed the kind of authentic seer abilities that would make her teaching truly valuable to students. Her responses to his questions about specific prophetic techniques were learned, but lacked the intuitive understanding that came from personal experience with genuine visions. The disappointment was not unexpected. Dumbledore had interviewed dozens of candidates over the years, and most had proven to be skilled performers rather than authentic practitioners of prophetic arts. The position of divination professor at Hogwarts had been difficult to fill precisely because true seers were so rare, and those who possessed genuine abilities were often too psychologically fragile to function in a teaching environment. He had hoped that the Trelawney family connection might indicate inherited talent, but hereditary gifts were notoriously unpredictable in their manifestation. After 20 minutes of polite but increasingly formal conversation, Dumbledore began to prepare his customary rejection speech, kind but firm words that would spare the candidate's feelings while making clear that the position would not be offered. He had delivered such speeches so often that the phrases came automatically. Expressions of appreciation for her interest, combined with gentle explanations about finding the right match between candidate and institutional needs. Sybil listened to his opening remarks with the resigned acceptance of someone who had faced such disappointments before. But as Dumbledore rose from his chair and turned toward the door, preparing to conclude the interview with handshakes and wishes for future success, the atmosphere in the room suddenly changed in ways that made the air itself feel heavy and charged with supernatural energy. The temperature dropped perceptibly, as if some presence had entered the space that drew warmth from its surroundings to fuel its manifestation. The magical instruments that Dumbledore carried, his wand, his pocket watch, various protective charms, all began to resonate with harmonics that spoke of forces beyond ordinary magical experience. Sybil Trelawney's entire demeanor transformed in the span of seconds, her previously nervous and affected manner replaced by something primal and otherworldly. Her eyes, which had been darting nervously around the room throughout their conversation, became fixed and staring. Their pupils dilated to black circles that seemed to reflect depths beyond normal sight. Her breathing changed to a slow, rhythmic pattern that reminded Dumbledore of the trance states he had observed in ancient magical rituals, while her body became rigid with a kind of tension that suggested enormous forces contained within mortal flesh. When she spoke again, it was not with the high, fluttery voice that had characterized her interview responses, but with tones that seemed to emerge from some cavern deep within the earth. The sound was harsh and hoarse, carrying undertones of authority that commanded attention despite its almost painful quality. Dumbledore recognized immediately that he was witnessing something extraordinary, the manifestation of genuine prophetic trance that he had read about in ancient texts, but never expected to observe personally. The words that emerged from Sybil's lips carried the unmistakable quality of true prophecy. Each syllable weighted with cosmic significance that seemed to resonate through multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously. "The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches," she intoned, her voice carrying echoes that seemed to originate from sources beyond her physical form. The phrase hung in the air like visible text, its meaning both crystal clear and infinitely mysterious, suggesting possibilities that were both wonderful and terrible. Dumbledore stood transfixed as the prophecy continued to unfold, each word adding new layers of complexity to a vision that was clearly describing events of enormous historical importance. "Born to those who have thrice defied him," the harsh voice continued, painting images of families whose courage had already marked them for special attention from forces that would soon reshape the wizarding world. The specificity was remarkable, not merely resistance to evil in general, but 3 specific acts of defiance that would serve as qualifications for an honor that was also a burden. The temporal reference that followed was equally precise and mysterious. "Born as the 7th month dies." Dumbledore's mind immediately began calculating possibilities, understanding that this detail would eventually allow identification of the prophecy's subject, but also recognizing that such knowledge would bring with it terrible responsibilities. July's end suggested a birth timing that was specific enough to be useful but common enough to create uncertainty, a divine ambiguity that would preserve free will while providing necessary guidance. The most chilling portion of the prophecy came next, words that would haunt Dumbledore's thoughts for years to come. "And the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal." The implications were staggering. Not merely that evil would recognize the prophesied child as a threat, but that some form of marking would occur that would create a permanent connection between light and darkness. The prophecy was describing not just a hero's birth, but a cosmic balancing that would bind opposing forces in ways that transcended ordinary magical understanding. But even as the prophecy spoke of darkness and marking, it also revealed a source of hope that would prove crucial to the eventual outcome. "But he will have power the Dark Lord knows not." This was perhaps the most significant detail of all, suggesting that the ultimate confrontation would be decided not by superior magical force, but by some quality or ability that evil could neither understand nor counter. The power unknown to darkness would be the key to victory, though the prophecy offered no hints about what form this mysterious advantage might take. The final portion of the vision was the most absolute and terrifying. "And either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives." These words established parameters that would govern all future interactions between the prophesied child and the Dark Lord, creating a cosmic imperative that would ultimately drive both figures toward confrontation. There could be no negotiation, no compromise, no alternative resolution. One would kill the other, or both would remain locked in eternal conflict. As the last words of the prophecy echoed through the small room, Sybil Trelawney's body began to relax from its state of supernatural tension. Her eyes, which had been staring into dimensions beyond normal sight, slowly refocused on the present moment. Her breathing returned to normal patterns, while the otherworldly authority that had characterized her prophetic voice gave way to confusion and exhaustion. She blinked several times, as if awakening from deep sleep, and looked around the room with the bewildered expression of someone who had lost several minutes of conscious experience. Dumbledore remained standing by the door, his mind racing to process the implications of what he had just witnessed. The prophecy was authentic beyond any doubt. The magical resonances that had accompanied its delivery, the specific details that carried the ring of cosmic truth, and most importantly, the complete transformation of the speaker, all testified to its genuine nature. He was looking at someone who had just served as a conduit for knowledge that originated beyond human consciousness, a vessel through which the universe itself had chosen to communicate information about events of world-changing significance. But even as he recognized the prophecy's authenticity, Dumbledore was also aware of a presence that should not have been there. A subtle wrongness in the room's magical atmosphere that suggested they were no longer alone. His enhanced senses, honed by decades of experience with dangerous situations, detected the lingering traces of human presence near the door, evidence that someone had been listening to at least part of the prophetic utterance. The eavesdropper was gone now, but the magical residue of their presence was still detectable to someone who knew what to look for. The implications of unauthorized overhearing were immediately apparent and deeply troubling. Prophecies of this magnitude were dangerous knowledge that could influence the course of history if they fell into the wrong hands. The fact that someone had been present during the delivery meant that information about the prophesied child was already compromised, potentially putting innocent lives at risk from forces that would seek to prevent the prophecy's fulfillment or twist it to serve their own dark purposes. Dumbledore's immediate priority became ensuring Sybil's safety, understanding that anyone capable of delivering such significant prophecies would be invaluable to those who sought to control or exploit prophetic knowledge. He quickly cast protective charms around the room, wards that would prevent further magical eavesdropping and shield their continuing conversation from outside observation. The spells were subtle but comprehensive, creating a bubble of privacy that would allow them to discuss the implications of what had just occurred without fear of additional unauthorized listeners. Sybil herself seemed largely unaware of the momentous nature of what she had just experienced. She complained of feeling tired and slightly confused, as if she had dozed off during their conversation and was struggling to remember where they had left off. This reaction was entirely consistent with authentic prophetic experience, as true seers typically had no conscious memory of their visions, their normal personalities returning without knowledge of the cosmic forces that had temporarily displaced them. When Dumbledore gently informed her that she had just delivered a prophecy of extraordinary significance, Sybil's reaction was a mixture of excitement and disbelief. She had hoped all her life that she might inherit her ancestors' gift, but the reality of actually experiencing prophetic trance was more overwhelming than she had anticipated. The exhaustion she felt was profound, as if the act of serving as a conduit for supernatural knowledge had drained her life force in ways that would take days or weeks to fully recover from. The conversation that followed was conducted in hushed tones, with Dumbledore carefully explaining the implications of what had occurred, while avoiding details that might unnecessarily frighten someone who was still processing the shock of discovering her own prophetic abilities. He described the responsibilities that came with being a true seer, the protections that would be necessary to ensure her safety, and the crucial importance of keeping the prophecy's contents absolutely secret until the proper time came for action. Sybil's appointment to the divination position at Hogwarts was settled within minutes of the prophecy's delivery, though now for reasons entirely different from those that had brought them together initially. Her role would no longer be simply that of a teacher filling a vacant position, but as someone whose protection was essential to the future of the magical world. Hogwarts, with its ancient defenses and powerful protective enchantments, would serve as a sanctuary where she could develop her newfound abilities while remaining safe from those who might seek to exploit or eliminate her. The practical arrangements for her new position were handled with unusual speed and attention to security. Her quarters within the castle would be specially warded, her movements monitored discreetly, and her access to information carefully controlled to prevent inadvertent revelation of sensitive knowledge. Most importantly, the true reason for her employment would remain known only to Dumbledore himself, while the broader Hogwarts community would understand her presence only in terms of her official teaching responsibilities. As they prepared to leave the Hogs Head Inn, Dumbledore cast additional protective charms that would shield Sybil during their journey to Hogwarts and ensure that their departure would not be observed by hostile forces. The magical traces left by their eavesdropper had been analysed as thoroughly as possible given the limited time available, but the identity of the listener remained unknown. This uncertainty would continue to trouble Dumbledore in the days and weeks that followed, as he struggled to determine how much of the prophecy had been overheard and who might be in possession of information that could endanger the prophesied child. The ride to Hogwarts was conducted largely in silence, with both passengers absorbed in contemplating the implications of the evening's extraordinary events. Sybil dozed fitfully, her exhausted mind processing the trauma of her first conscious prophetic experience, while Dumbledore planned the complex arrangements that would be necessary to protect both her and the unknown child whose fate had been revealed in her vision. The weight of prophetic knowledge was settling on both of them, creating responsibilities that would influence every decision they made for years to come. Upon arriving at Hogwarts, Dumbledore immediately began implementing security measures that went far beyond normal procedures for new faculty appointments. Sybil's tower room was prepared with protective enchantments that rivaled those protecting the castle's most sensitive areas, while her teaching schedule was arranged to minimize her exposure to potentially dangerous situations. Most importantly, he began the delicate process of investigating the prophecy's implications, trying to identify which families might fit the criteria described in the vision. The search for candidates who met the prophecy's specifications was conducted with absolute discretion, using resources and contacts that Dumbledore had developed during his long career as both educator and leader in the struggle against dark forces. The requirement that the child be born to those who have thrice defied the Dark Lord significantly narrowed the field of possibilities, as relatively few families had achieved such specific levels of resistance to Voldemort's growing influence. Two families emerged as primary candidates, the Potters and the Longbottoms, both of whom had demonstrated exactly the kind of courage and defiance that the prophecy seemed to describe. James and Lily Potter had repeatedly frustrated Voldemort's plans through their work with the Order of the Phoenix, while Frank and Alice Longbottom had similarly distinguished themselves as opponents of dark forces. Both couples were expecting children whose births would coincide with the temporal requirements specified in Sybil's vision. The identification of possible candidates brought with it a new level of urgency to Dumbledore's planning, as he understood that both families would need protection, regardless of which child ultimately proved to be the prophesied one. The security arrangements became extraordinarily complex, involving multiple layers of concealment, protection, and contingency planning that would be activated the moment either child was born. The stakes were too high to risk any possibility that the Dark Lord might eliminate the prophesied threat before it could mature enough to fulfill its destiny. But even as these protective measures were being implemented, the consequences of the overheard prophecy were already beginning to manifest in ways that would ultimately prove catastrophic. The partial information that had been gathered by the unknown eavesdropper was making its way through channels that would eventually carry it to Voldemort himself, setting in motion a chain of events that would transform the prophecy from mere possibility into inevitable reality. The cosmic forces that had spoken through Sybil Trelawney in that small room above the Hogs Head Inn had set wheels in motion that could no longer be stopped, creating a destiny that would reshape the wizarding world and establish her firmly in the lineage of Trelawney seers whose visions had influenced the course of magical history. The prophecy was no longer just words spoken in trance, but living force that would drive events toward their predetermined conclusion, regardless of the choices made by those who sought to control their own fates. Deep beneath the bustling corridors of the Ministry of Magic, where the weight of centuries presses down through layers of enchanted stone, and the very air thrums with accumulated magical energy, lies a realm that few wizards have ever glimpsed, and fewer still have survived to describe. Level 9, the Department of Mysteries, exists in a state of perpetual twilight, its halls illuminated by torches that burn with flames that cast no shadows, their light seeming to emerge from some dimension beyond ordinary fire. Here, in chambers that exist partially outside normal space-time, the most dangerous and incomprehensible aspects of magical knowledge are studied, contained, and jealously guarded by those who have dedicated their lives to understanding forces that lesser minds cannot safely contemplate. The unspeakables who work within these depths are figures of legend and whispered speculation throughout the magical world, their identities hidden behind enchanted masks, and their research shrouded in secrecy so absolute that even their own families often know nothing of their true occupations. They move through the department's labyrinthine corridors like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by spells that prevent sound from carrying beyond intended ears, their conversations conducted in languages that shift and change to prevent unauthorized comprehension. These are the guardians of mysteries that predate recorded history, the keepers of knowledge that could reshape reality itself if allowed to fall into unworthy hands. Among the many chambers that honeycomb the department's sprawling complex, none is more carefully protected or more feared by those who know of its existence than the Hall of Prophecy. This vast circular room stretches beyond the reach of normal sight, its dimensions expanded through spatial magic that creates interior space far larger than the physical boundaries should permit. The ceiling disappears into darkness so complete that even magical light cannot penetrate its depths, while the floor extends in all directions like a sea of polished black stone that reflects images from times and places that have not yet come to pass. The most striking feature of the hall is the towering shelves that rise from floor to invisible ceiling, their heights accessible only through staircases that spiral through dimensions folded upon themselves, like origami crafted from space-time itself. These shelves hold thousands upon thousands of prophecy orbs, each one a sphere of spun glass so delicate that it seems to glow with inner light, yet so magically reinforced that it could survive the destruction of the building around it. The orbs float in precisely maintained positions, held in place by spells that account for gravitational fluctuations, temporal drift, and the subtle magical pressures that prophecy naturally exerts on its physical surroundings. Each prophecy orb contains not merely recorded words but living essence of the vision that created it, captured at the moment of utterance. and preserved in crystalline matrices that maintain both the prophetic content and the temporal energy that gave it meaning. The process of creating these vessels requires magical techniques that push the boundaries of what mortal wizards can safely attempt, involving the manipulation of time itself to freeze prophetic moments in states of eternal present. The glass must be spun during the precise seconds when prophecy is being spoken, its molecular structure altered by exposure to temporal forces that exist only during authentic visionary experiences. The creation of a prophecy orb begins the instant a true seer enters prophetic trance, as magical sensors throughout the wizarding world detect the unique energy signature that accompanies genuine prophetic utterance. Unspeakables trained in temporal magic immediately begin the complex process of temporal triangulation, using instruments that can pinpoint the exact location where prophecy is occurring and estimate the duration of the visionary episode. Speed is essential, as the window of opportunity for capturing prophetic essence lasts only as long as the seer remains in trance, and any delay can result in the loss of prophetic content that may never be recoverable. The glass itself is no ordinary material, but a substance created specifically for prophetic containment. Its composition, including elements that exist naturally only in locations where temporal anomalies have occurred, sand from beaches where time moves differently, minerals extracted from caves where past and future intersect, and crystalline structures formed in the presence of naturally occurring prophecy, all contribute to creating a medium capable of holding visions without distorting their essential meaning. The spinning process requires absolute precision, as even minor variations in temperature, magical field strength, or temporal alignment can render the resulting orb incapable of containing prophetic content. The most skilled artificers in the Department of Mysteries spend decades learning the techniques necessary for successful prophecy orb creation. And even then, the failure rate remains discouragingly high. A single orb might require dozens of attempts before the glass achieves the proper resonance with temporal forces, while the most complex prophecies may demand entirely new approaches to containment that push the boundaries of existing magical theory. The few artificers who master these techniques become invaluable resources within the department, their knowledge so specialized that their deaths often result in the permanent loss of crucial technical capabilities. Once created, each prophecy orb is subjected to extensive analysis to determine its contents, significance, and proper classification within the department's elaborate cataloging system. This process requires unspeakables who specialize in prophetic interpretation, individuals whose minds have been specially trained to process temporal information without suffering the psychological damage that typically accompanies exposure to future knowledge. These specialists work in carefully controlled conditions. Their exposure to prophetic content, limited to prevent the kind of temporal displacement that has claimed the sanity of too many researchers who delved too deeply into mysteries they were not equipped to understand. The labeling system used for prophecy orbs reflects both bureaucratic necessity and mystical tradition, combining precise administrative details with symbolic representations that honor the sacred nature of prophetic knowledge. Each orb bears a designation that includes the date of its creation, the geographical location where the prophecy was spoken, and a classification code that indicates the level of cosmic significance attributed to its contents. But beneath these practical markings lie symbols and sigils that connect each prophecy to the broader pattern of fate and destiny that governs all temporal magic. The names that appear on prophecy labels are themselves carefully protected information, as the identification of individuals mentioned in prophetic visions can create dangerous vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit. The magical protections woven into the labeling process ensure that only those directly referenced in a prophecy can read the names that appear on its orb, while unauthorized observers see only blank spaces where identification should be written. This protection serves both to maintain privacy and to prevent the premature revelation of prophetic content to those who might misuse such knowledge. The shelving system within the Hall of Prophecy follows organizational principles that reflect deep understanding of how prophetic knowledge interacts with the flow of time itself. Orbs containing related prophecies are grouped together in configurations that create magical resonances between their contents, allowing trained researchers to identify patterns and connections that might otherwise remain hidden. The arrangement changes constantly as new prophecies are added and existing ones fulfill their purposes, the shelves themselves possessing a form of consciousness that guides their reorganization according to principles that even the unspeakables do not fully comprehend. The magical protections surrounding the Hall of Prophecy are among the most sophisticated defensive spells ever created, layered in depths that would challenge even the most skilled curse breakers to penetrate. The outermost defenses consist of conventional security measures, locked doors, alarm charms, and guardian creatures that patrol the approaches to the chamber. But as one moves deeper into the protective matrix, the spells become increasingly esoteric and dangerous, drawing upon forms of magic that exist at the intersection of multiple disciplines. Temporal wards prevent unauthorized time travel that might allow thieves to steal prophecies before their protection was established, while dimensional barriers block access through magical spaces that exist parallel to normal reality. The most subtle protections are those that target the minds of potential intruders, creating confusion and disorientation that makes navigation through the hall's vast spaces nearly impossible for anyone who lacks proper authorization. These mental defenses are calibrated to respond to intent rather than mere presence, understanding that some visitors may have legitimate reasons for entering the chamber, even if they lack formal permission. The guardians that patrol the Hall of Prophecy are creatures specially bred for their unique combination of intelligence, loyalty, and sensitivity to temporal anomalies. These beings, whose exact nature remains classified even within the Department of Mysteries, possess the ability to perceive threats that exist across multiple timelines simultaneously, allowing them to respond to dangers before they fully manifest in present reality. Their presence serves both as active protection and as early warning system, alerting the unspeakables to potential security breaches that conventional magical sensors might miss. The retrieval protocols for prophecy orbs reflect the understanding that these artifacts are too dangerous to be handled casually, even by those authorized to study their contents. Each removal from the shelves must be logged and approved through chains of command that reach to the highest levels of department leadership, while the orbs themselves are never transported without extensive protective escorts and magical containment that prevents accidental activation of their contents. The few occasions when prophecies have been removed from the hall for external consultation have required security measures comparable to those used for transporting the most dangerous dark artifacts in ministry custody. The study facilities within the Hall of Prophecy are designed to allow safe examination of prophetic content under controlled conditions that minimize the risk of temporal contamination or psychological damage to researchers. These chambers are lined with materials that absorb and neutralize the temporal radiation that prophecy orbs naturally emit, while specialized magical instruments allow detailed analysis of prophetic content without requiring direct exposure to the visions themselves. The research protocols developed for these facilities represent centuries of accumulated knowledge about the safest methods for extracting information from prophecies without triggering the fulfillment mechanisms that many such visions contain. The historical significance of prophecies stored within the hall cannot be overstated, as many of the most important events in wizarding history were first glimpsed in visions that now rest on these endless shelves. The rise and fall of magical kingdoms, the discovery of new forms of magic, the births of individuals who would reshape their societies, all were foretold in prophecies that unspeakables have studied and protected for generations. The patterns that emerge from comparative analysis of these visions provide insights into the fundamental structure of fate itself, revealing the mechanisms by which cosmic forces guide the development of magical civilization. Among the most carefully guarded prophecies are those that describe events so far in the future that their fulfillment may not occur for centuries or millennia to come. These long-term visions require special preservation techniques that account for the gradual decay of temporal energy over extended periods, while their contents are studied by specialists who understand that they may be glimpsing possibilities that their own great-grandchildren will never live to witness. The responsibility of maintaining these far future prophecies weighs heavily on the department, as their loss could deprive future generations of crucial guidance about challenges and opportunities that lie beyond current imagination. The international cooperation necessary for effective prophecy protection has created diplomatic relationships between the Ministry of Magic and similar institutions throughout the magical world, as prophecies often transcend national boundaries in their scope and significance. Copies of particularly important visions are maintained in multiple secure locations, while communication protocols allow for the rapid sharing of prophetic intelligence when global threats emerge that require coordinated responses. These relationships have proven crucial during periods of international magical crisis, when prophecies held in one nation's archives have provided essential guidance for addressing threats that affect the entire wizarding world. The psychological support systems available to unspeakables who work with prophetic material reflect hard-won understanding of the mental health consequences associated with regular exposure to future knowledge. The human mind, even one trained in advanced magical disciplines, is not equipped to process information about events that have not yet occurred, and prolonged contact with prophetic content can result in temporal displacement disorders that permanently separate individuals from normal experience of present reality. The department maintains specialized healers whose sole responsibility is treating these unique forms of psychological damage, though their success rates remain frustratingly limited. The philosophical implications of prophecy storage and study have generated debates within the department that continue across generations of researchers, touching on fundamental questions about the nature of free will and predetermination. Some scholars argue that prophecies describe inevitable futures that cannot be changed regardless of human action, while others contend that visions represent merely probable outcomes that can be influenced through informed decision-making. These theoretical disputes have practical consequences for how prophecies are interpreted and acted upon, as different philosophical approaches lead to dramatically different conclusions about the proper response to prophetic warnings. The technological innovations developed specifically for prophecy research have contributed to advances in magical theory that extend far beyond the Department of Mysteries itself. Instruments created to analyze temporal radiation have proven useful for studying other forms of exotic magic, while techniques developed for protecting researchers from prophetic contamination have applications in curse-breaking and dark arts defense. The specialized knowledge accumulated through centuries of prophecy study has made the department's researchers among the most advanced magical theorists in the world, though their expertise remains largely hidden from the broader magical community. The economic costs associated with maintaining the Hall of Prophecy are enormous, requiring resources that represent a significant portion of the ministry's total budget for magical research and development. The specialized materials needed for orb creation, the rare magical creatures employed as guardians, The extensive protective enchantments that must be maintained and regularly updated all contribute to expenses that would bankrupt smaller, magical institutions. Yet the investment is considered essential by those who understand the strategic value of prophetic knowledge, as accurate information about future threats and opportunities provides advantages that no amount of conventional magical power could match. The training programs for new unspeakables assigned to prophecy research are among the most rigorous and selective in the magical world, requiring candidates who possess not only exceptional magical ability, but also the psychological resilience necessary to work with temporal forces that can shatter unprepared minds. The failure rate for these programs exceeds 90%, as most applicants discover that they lack either the magical strength or the mental stability required for safe exposure to prophetic content. Those who do succeed in completing the training often find that their experiences have changed them in ways that make normal social relationships difficult or impossible to maintain. The succession planning within the department reflects understanding that much of the specialized knowledge required for prophecy research cannot be easily transferred between individuals, as each researcher develops personal techniques and insights that are deeply connected to their own unique magical characteristics. The loss of senior researchers often results in temporary reductions in the department's capabilities until replacement personnel can develop equivalent expertise, a process that may require decades of careful training and gradual exposure to increasingly complex prophetic material. The coordination between the Hall of Prophecy and other areas within the Department of Mysteries creates opportunities for research that would be impossible in isolation, as prophetic knowledge often intersects with studies of time, space, thought, and the other fundamental mysteries that occupy departmental resources. Joint projects between different research divisions have produced insights into the deep structure of reality itself, revealing connections between consciousness, time, and magical energy that suggest possibilities for advancement in magical theory that could revolutionize wizarding society. As our journey through these hidden depths draws toward its restful conclusion, let yourself be comforted by the knowledge that somewhere in the darkness below London's busy streets, dedicated guardians maintain eternal watch over visions that protect the future from threats it cannot yet imagine. Their silent vigil, ensuring that tomorrow's possibilities remain safe within crystalline spheres that hold infinity in their delicate embrace. The summer of 1980 began with an ominous silence that seemed to settle over the magical world like a shroud woven from unspoken fears and half-remembered nightmares. In the modest cottage on Godric's Hollow where James and Lily Potter had made their home, the walls themselves seemed to hold their breath as July drew to its close, as if the ancient stones understood that they were sheltering something precious beyond measure. A child whose very existence had been foretold in prophecy and whose birth would set in motion events that would reshape the destiny of magical civilization itself. The pregnancy had been difficult in ways that went far beyond ordinary maternal challenges, as Lily's magical core struggled to accommodate the developing life within her womb. Strange dreams plagued her sleep, visions of golden light battling serpentine shadows, while her unborn child seemed to respond to magical disturbances with movements that left her breathless and trembling. James watched over her with the devoted intensity of someone who understood that they were protecting not just his wife and child, but the future itself, his Aurora training alerting him to dangers that lurked in every shadow and whispered through every breeze. The security measures surrounding their home had been implemented under Dumbledore's direct supervision, layers of protective magic so sophisticated that they pushed the boundaries of what defensive enchantments could achieve. The Fidelius charm that concealed their location was just the outermost shell of protections that included time delay curses, dimensional displacement wards, and emergency escape portkeys that could transport them to safety within milliseconds of detection. Yet for all these precautions, both parents felt the weight of prophecy pressing down upon them, understanding that their child's fate was already written in words spoken by a seer whose visions had never proven false. Across the village, in another carefully warded home, Frank and Alice Longbottom experienced their own version of prophetic anxiety as they prepared for the arrival of their son. Their pregnancy had been marked by different but equally troubling signs: magical instruments that responded to the unborn child's presence with readings that suggested abilities far beyond normal infant development, while divination specialists consulted in secret, reported visions too confused and contradictory to interpret with confidence. The couple knew that their child might be the prophesied one, but they also understood that uncertainty itself was a form of protection, as enemies who could not identify their target precisely were less likely to act decisively. The dual possibility created by the prophecy's wording had been both blessing and curse for those charged with protecting the potential chosen ones. Dumbledore's agents maintained surveillance over both families, while struggling with the knowledge that their resources were necessarily divided between two equally important targets. The Order of the Phoenix developed contingency plans that accounted for various scenarios. What if both children were born on the same day? What if neither proved to be the prophesied one? What if the Dark Lord discovered their identities before the truth became clear? The magical community itself remained largely unaware of the prophecy's existence, though sensitive individuals throughout Britain reported strange dreams and portents that suggested something momentous was approaching. Seers who lacked Sybil Trelawney's precision spoke in vague terms of a great change coming, while magical creatures exhibited behaviors that typically preceded events of cosmic significance. Even the weather seemed affected, with unusual patterns of magical aurora appearing in northern skies and ley lines throughout the country, reporting fluctuations that suggested reality itself was preparing for transformation. On the night of July 30th, as the 7th month prepared to breathe its last, Alice Longbottom went into labour in the secure ward of Street Mungo's hospital that had been specially prepared for the birth. The delivery was attended by healers who had been carefully selected for their discretion and loyalty, while aurors maintained invisible watch from concealment charms that rendered them undetectable to all but the most sophisticated magical senses. The child who emerged into the world just before midnight was healthy and apparently normal, though the magical readings taken during his first moments of life suggested latent abilities that would eventually prove extraordinary. Neville Frank Longbottom's birth was recorded with the kind of careful documentation that would allow future scholars to verify every detail of the event, while protective spells immediately began weaving themselves around the infant to shield him from magical detection and supernatural harm. The healers noted the child's unusual calmness during the delivery process and the way magical instruments seemed to respond to his presence with harmonics that spoke of deep connections to natural magical forces. Yet for all the careful observation and analysis, no one could determine whether this was the child of prophecy or simply another magical infant born during a time of heightened supernatural tension. 24 hours later, as July 31st dawned with golden light that seemed to carry unusual warmth and clarity, Lily Potter's contractions began in earnest within the heavily protected confines of their Godric's Hollow cottage. The decision to deliver at home rather than at Street Mungo's had been made after extensive consultation with security specialists, who determined that the additional protections possible in a private residence outweighed the medical advantages of hospital delivery. The cottage had been transformed into a fortress disguised as a home, its every room warded against intrusion and its foundations anchored with defensive magic that drew power directly from the ancient ley lines that crisscrossed the village. The birth itself was attended by healers who had sworn magical oaths of secrecy that would prevent them from revealing any details of the event, even under torture or veritaserum interrogation. James paced the cottage's protected perimeter like a caged wolf, his every instinct screaming warnings about dangers that his rational mind knew were being held at bay by some of the most sophisticated protective magic ever created. The summer evening was unnaturally quiet, as if all of nature was holding its breath in anticipation of something that would either save or damn the magical world. Harry James Potter entered the world at 11:59 on July 31st, 1980. His first cry seeming to resonate through dimensions beyond the merely physical. The healers attending the birth noted immediately that this child was different from any they had previously delivered. His magical aura was visible, even to those without enhanced sight, manifesting as golden threads that seemed to weave themselves through the air around his tiny form. More remarkably, the protective wards surrounding the cottage responded to his presence by strengthening themselves, as if recognizing that they were now sheltering something that required unprecedented levels of protection. The moment of Harry's birth was recorded by magical instruments that had been specially designed to detect prophetic fulfillment, devices that immediately began registering readings that confirmed what many had suspected: this was indeed the child described in Sybil Trelawney's vision. The temporal resonances that surrounded his delivery matched exactly the cosmic signatures associated with authentic prophetic events, while divination specialists monitoring the birth from concealed locations reported visions of futures that suddenly snapped into focus with crystalline clarity. Yet, even as Harry's identity as the prophesied child became apparent to those with the knowledge and instruments to recognize such things, the cosmic forces that governed prophetic magic maintained the ambiguity that was essential to preserving free will within predetermined destiny. The prophecy had spoken of marking and choice, suggesting that the child's ultimate fate would be determined not by his birth alone, but by actions taken by the Dark Lord himself. Until Voldemort chose which child to consider his equal, both boys remained potential fulfillments of the prophetic vision. The intelligence networks that served both sides of the brewing conflict buzzed with activity as word of the dual birth spread through channels both official and clandestine. Death Eaters, who had learned fragments of prophetic information from sources they were careful not to identify, began surveillance operations designed to identify which child posed the greater threat to their master's plans. The Order of the Phoenix intensified protective measures around both families while struggling with the knowledge that their resources were being stretched beyond sustainable limits by the need to guard two equally important targets. Dumbledore himself spent countless hours in meditation and analysis, studying the prophecy's exact wording for clues that might indicate which child was truly the chosen one. His vast knowledge of prophetic interpretation suggested that the answer would come not through scholarly analysis, but through the actions of those mentioned in the vision itself. The Dark Lord would make the choice that determined which boy became his destined opponent, and that choice would transform possibility into inevitability with the finality of cosmic law. The magical characteristics that both children displayed during their first weeks of life were subjected to intense but discreet study by specialists who understood that they were observing the early development of abilities that might determine the fate of their entire civilization. Harry showed signs of magical strength that exceeded normal infant parameters, while his responses to various stimuli suggested awareness that went far beyond typical newborn consciousness. Neville demonstrated different but equally remarkable abilities, particularly in his interactions with plant life and his apparent sensitivity to natural magical rhythms. The psychological burden carried by both sets of parents was enormous, as they struggled to provide normal childcare while understanding that their sons might be destined for confrontation with the most dangerous, dark wizard in centuries. The knowledge that one of their children had been prophesied to either defeat or be destroyed by Voldemort created a form of parental anxiety that had no precedent in magical literature, requiring support from specialists who were themselves learning to cope with unprecedented psychological challenges. The security protocols developed for protecting the potential chosen ones became models for magical protection that would influence defensive theory for generations to come. Every aspect of the children's daily lives was analyzed for vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit, while contingency plans were developed for scenarios ranging from direct assault to subtle infiltration and psychological manipulation. The most troubling possibility was that the Dark Lord might attempt to turn the prophecy to his advantage by corrupting the prophesied child rather than simply destroying him, transforming the promised savior into an instrument of darkness. As summer gave way to autumn, the signs that one of the boys was indeed the prophesied child became increasingly apparent to those who possessed the knowledge to interpret such indicators. Divination specialists reported that their crystal balls showed different images when focused on Harry than when examining other magical children. While scrying, mirrors reflected depths that suggested connections to cosmic forces beyond normal magical experience. Most tellingly, Sybil Trelawney herself experienced intermittent episodes of enhanced prophetic sensitivity whenever she was in proximity to the Potter cottage, though she remained unaware of the specific reasons for these experiences. The investigation into who had overheard the original prophecy had continued throughout this period, with Auror investigators following every possible lead in their attempt to identify the security breach that had compromised such sensitive information. The magical traces left at the Hogs Head Inn had been analyzed by the Ministry's most skilled forensic specialists, but the results remained frustratingly incomplete. They could determine that the eavesdropper had been male, magically trained, and possessed of skills that suggested Death Eater affiliations, but his specific identity remained unknown. The partial nature of the overheard information created additional complications for protective planning, as no one could determine exactly how much prophetic detail had been compromised. If the eavesdropper had heard only the opening portions of the prophecy, Voldemort might know about the timing of the birth and the family background, but remain ignorant of the marking that would make the prophecy specific to one child. Alternatively, if more complete information had been transmitted, the Dark Lord might already be planning actions that would fulfill the prophecy's requirements, while believing he was preventing its realization. The magical community's growing awareness that something significant was approaching manifested in ways both subtle and dramatic. Sales of protective amulets and defensive magical items increased dramatically, while applications for emigration to distant magical communities reached levels not seen since Grindelwald's rise to power. Children born during this period were given names that carried protective connotations, while parents throughout Britain sought blessings from every available source of good fortune and divine favor. The international magical community watched developments in Britain with a mixture of concern and calculation, understanding that events there might have implications that extended far beyond national boundaries. Diplomatic communications between magical governments increased in frequency and urgency, while intelligence agencies attempted to gather information about prophecies and Dark Lords that their own seers might have overlooked. The American magical authorities offered assistance that was politely declined, while European magical communities began implementing their own defensive measures in case British conflicts spilled across their borders. The autumn months brought a series of increasingly aggressive Death Eater attacks that suggested Voldemort was growing impatient with traditional methods of expanding his influence and consolidating power. The targeting of these attacks seemed random to most observers, But Dumbledore recognized patterns that suggested the Dark Lord was attempting to force the prophesied child into the open through campaigns of terror that might compel protective forces to reveal their most carefully guarded secrets. The decision about which family required the most immediate protection was ultimately forced by intelligence that suggested Voldemort had narrowed his focus to a single target. Intercepted Death Eater communications indicated that their master had made his choice about which child to consider his prophesied enemy. Though the reasons for his selection remained unclear, the decision appeared to be based not on magical analysis or prophetic interpretation, but on personal factors that reflected the Dark Lord's own psychology and prejudices. The revelation that Voldemort had chosen Harry Potter as his target transformed the prophetic possibility into cosmic certainty, setting in motion the final events that would fulfill Sybil Trelawney's vision. The marking mentioned in the prophecy would soon occur, creating the connection between light and dark that would define their eternal struggle. The power that the Dark Lord knew not would be revealed through sacrifice and love, while the final confrontation that would determine the fate of magical civilization drew ever closer. The preparations for what many sensed would be the culminating battle began immediately, as protective forces marshaled every resource available for the defense of a child whose survival had become synonymous with the continuation of everything good and decent in their world. The cottage in Godric's Hollow was transformed into a fortress that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about magical defense, while contingency plans were activated that would either preserve the prophesied child or ensure that his sacrifice would not be meaningless. Yet even as these preparations proceeded with desperate urgency, the cosmic forces that governed prophetic magic maintained their insistence on free will within predetermined destiny. The prophecy would be fulfilled, but its outcome remained dependent on choices yet to be made by individuals whose love, courage, and sacrifice would determine whether darkness or light would ultimately triumph in the struggle that was about to reach its inevitable climax. The boy who had been marked by prophecy before his birth slept peacefully in his crib, unaware that his dreams were being shaped by visions of futures that he alone possessed the power to create or prevent. While outside his protected nursery, the forces of destiny prepared for the confrontation that would either save or destroy the world that prophecy had promised he was born to defend. The winter of 1994 settled over Hogwarts Castle with unusual intensity, as if the ancient stones themselves were preparing for revelations that would shake the very foundations of the magical world. In the North Tower, where drafts whistled through windows that had witnessed centuries of divination and prophecy, Sybil Trelawney sat in her incense-laden classroom, unaware that she was about to deliver the second great prophecy of her life. The first had shaped the fate of Harry Potter and changed the course of wizarding history, but this new vision would herald the return of darkness that many had hoped was banished forever. The circumstances that led to this second prophetic moment were as mundane as they were fateful. Harry Potter, now in his third year at Hogwarts, had been serving detention in Professor Trelawney's classroom, his punishment for the kind of minor infractions that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The evening was cold and still, with snow falling steadily outside the tower windows, and the fire in the grate burning low enough to cast dancing shadows across the crystal balls and star charts that filled the circular room. Sybil had been in one of her theatrical moods, dramatically lamenting the poor quality of her students' divination homework while making pronouncements about the tragic fates that awaited those who failed to take the mystical arts seriously. Harry endured her performance with the resigned patience of someone who had grown accustomed to adults making dramatic pronouncements about his destiny. His attention focused more on the mundane task of cleaning crystal balls than on his professor's familiar complaints about unappreciated genius. The transformation came without warning, just as it had during that fateful interview at the Hogs Head Inn 15 years earlier. One moment, Sybil was gesticulating dramatically about the inadequacy of modern magical education, and the next she had gone rigid in her chair, her magnified eyes suddenly focusing on something far beyond the confines of her classroom. The temperature in the room dropped perceptibly, while the flames in the fireplace began to burn with colors that had nothing to do with ordinary combustion. Harry recognized immediately that he was witnessing something extraordinary. Though his understanding of prophetic trance was limited to theoretical knowledge gleaned from his defense against the dark arts studies, the voice that emerged from Professor Trelawney's throat was the same harsh, otherworldly tone that had characterized her first great prophecy, carrying undertones of cosmic authority that commanded absolute attention, despite its almost painful quality. The words that followed would haunt Harry for years to come, describing events so terrible that his mind initially refused to accept their implications. The Dark Lord lies alone and friendless, the prophetic voice intoned, painting an image of Voldemort's current state that contradicted everything the wizarding world believed about his permanent defeat. The phrase suggested not death but isolation, a distinction that would prove crucial to understanding the true nature of what had occurred on that Halloween night 13 years earlier. The prophecy continued with details that were both specific and terrifying. Abandoned by his followers. These words revealed the depth of Voldemort's fall from power, describing how even his most devoted Death Eaters had fled or denied their allegiance. When faced with his apparent destruction, the image was one of complete social and political collapse. A Dark Lord, reduced to solitude so absolute that even his enemies might feel momentary pity for his condition, if they understood the cosmic loneliness that such abandonment represented. But the most chilling portion of the vision was yet to come. His servant has been chained these 12 years. The temporal reference was precise and specific, pointing to someone who had been imprisoned or constrained since the night of Voldemort's downfall. Harry's immediate assumption was that the prophecy referred to Sirius Black, the convicted mass murderer who had recently escaped from Azkaban after 12 years of imprisonment, and who everyone believed had been Voldemort's most trusted lieutenant. The prophecy's next revelation carried implications that would not be fully understood until events began to unfold exactly as the vision had foretold. Tonight, before midnight, the servant will break free and set out to rejoin his master. The specificity was remarkable and terrifying, providing not just a prediction of what would happen, but precisely when it would occur. This was not vague divination, but exact temporal prophecy, describing events with the kind of accuracy that only authentic seer abilities could achieve. The final portion of the prophecy delivered the most devastating news of all. The Dark Lord will rise again with his servant's aid, greater and more terrible than ever he was. These words shattered any remaining hope that Voldemort's defeat had been permanent, revealing that the events of Halloween 1981 had been merely a temporary setback rather than final victory. Worse still, the prophecy suggested that the Dark Lord's return would make him more dangerous than before, as if his apparent death had somehow enhanced rather than diminished his power. As the last echoes of the prophetic voice faded from the tower room, Sybil Trelawney slumped forward in her chair with the familiar exhaustion that followed authentic prophetic episodes. Her breathing was labored, and her skin pale, as if the effort of serving as a conduit for cosmic knowledge had drained her life force in ways that would require days to recover from. Most tellingly, she had no memory of what she had just spoken, awakening from her trance with the confused disorientation that marked genuine prophetic experience. Harry sat frozen in his chair, his mind struggling to process the implications of what he had just witnessed. Unlike the adults who had heard Sybil's first prophecy, he lacked the theoretical knowledge and emotional preparation necessary to cope with such devastating revelations. The idea that Voldemort might return was so far outside his understanding of how the world worked that his initial reaction was simple denial, a psychological defense mechanism that protected him from accepting truths too terrible to contemplate. But even as Harry's conscious mind rejected the prophecy's implications, deeper instincts recognized the authenticity of what he had experienced. The magical resonances that had accompanied Sybil's trance, the otherworldly quality of her transformed voice, and most importantly, the specific details that felt too precise to be mere imagination, all testified to the genuine nature of the vision. This was not theatrical performance but real prophecy, delivered by someone whose abilities had already proven their accuracy through the most dramatic possible validation. The immediate aftermath of the prophecy was marked by Sybil's characteristic confusion about what had occurred during her period of altered consciousness. She complained of feeling unusually tired and asked Harry if she had dozed off during their detention session. Her concern focused on maintaining professional dignity, rather than exploring the possibility that she might have experienced another prophetic episode. Her complete lack of awareness about the significance of what had just happened was both blessing and curse, protecting her from the psychological burden of knowing that she had just announced the return of ultimate evil while preventing her from providing additional insights that might have helped prepare for what was coming. Harry's attempts to question Professor Trelawney about what she remembered from the past few minutes were met with the kind of vague responses that suggested her amnesia was complete and permanent. She recalled giving him detention and discussing the poor quality of his divination homework, but everything from the moment of prophetic trance until her return to normal consciousness was simply gone, erased by the same protective mechanisms that shielded all true seers from remembering their own visions. The walk back to Gryffindor Tower through Hogwarts' darkened corridors gave Harry time to consider whether he should report what he had witnessed to someone in authority. The logical choice would have been Professor Dumbledore, whose knowledge of prophetic magic and experience with Voldemort made him the most qualified person to interpret the vision's significance. But Harry was also aware that his credibility regarding supernatural matters was already suspect among many faculty members, who viewed his tendency to encounter extraordinary situations with a mixture of concern and skepticism. The decision about whether to share his knowledge became moot when events began unfolding exactly as the prophecy had foretold. That very night, as the castle slept peacefully under its blanket of snow, Peter Pettigrew completed his transformation from rat to human form for the first time in 12 years, breaking free from the magical imprisonment that his animagus disguise had represented. The servant mentioned in the prophecy was not Sirius Black, as Harry had assumed, but the man who had betrayed his parents and spent more than a decade hiding in plain sight as a pet rat. The revelation of Peter Pettigrew's true identity and his role in the events that had shaped Harry's life came with a devastating clarity that validated every word of Sybil's prophecy. The man who had been chained for 12 years was not imprisoned by walls and bars, but by his own cowardice and the necessity of maintaining a disguise that prevented him from returning to his master's service. His liberation came not through escape from Azkaban, but through the exposure of his true nature and the restoration of his human form. The prophecy's accuracy extended to details that seemed impossibly precise when first spoken, but proved devastatingly accurate in their fulfillment. Pettigrew's departure from Hogwarts occurred exactly as predicted, before midnight on the specified date, as he fled into the night to begin the journey that would reunite him with his master. The timeline was so exact that those who witnessed his escape could track the prophecy's fulfillment almost to the minute, providing validation of Sybil's abilities that even skeptics could not dismiss. But the most significant aspect of the prophecy was its revelation that Voldemort's apparent death had been illusion rather than reality. The Dark Lord had indeed been reduced to a state of existence so diminished that it resembled death, but his essential being had survived in forms so alien to normal life that even his most devoted followers had been unable to recognize his continued existence. The Prophecies' description of him as alone and friendless captured not just his political isolation, but the cosmic loneliness that came from existing in states between life and death that no other consciousness could share. The year that followed the Prophecies' delivery was marked by increasingly ominous signs that suggested dark forces were indeed stirring in ways that the magical community was not yet ready to acknowledge. Mysterious disappearances began occurring with greater frequency, while magical creatures throughout Britain exhibited the kind of agitated behavior that typically preceded major supernatural disturbances. Most telling of all, other seers began reporting dreams and visions that seemed to echo themes from Sibyl's prophecy, though none possessed her clarity or specificity of vision. The summer of 1994 brought with it the Triwizard Tournament and the events that would provide Voldemort with the opportunity to fulfill the Prophecy's promise of return. The elaborate plan that culminated in the graveyard at Little Hangleton was orchestrated by servants who had remained loyal despite years of apparent abandonment, their faith in their master's survival vindicated by the very prophecy that had predicted their reunion. The chalice that transported Harry to his confrontation with death carried with it the weight of prophetic inevitability, as if fate itself was guiding events toward their predetermined conclusion. The ritual that restored Voldemort to physical form represented the ultimate fulfillment of Sibyl's second prophecy, transforming prediction into reality through the combination of servant loyalty, dark magic, and the blood of the enemy who had originally caused his downfall. The Dark Lord who emerged from the cauldron was indeed greater and more terrible than before, his apparent death having taught him lessons about power and survival that made him more dangerous than he had ever been during his first reign of terror. Peter Pettigrew's role in this resurrection validated every detail of the prophetic vision, from his 12 years of constraint through his midnight escape, to his crucial assistance in the ritual that brought his master back to life. The prophecy had seen through the deceptions that had hidden his true nature for over a decade, recognizing him as the servant whose aid would prove essential to Voldemort's return. His transformation from coward to conspirator to crucial assistant followed the exact pattern that the prophecy had foretold, demonstrating once again the accuracy that marked all of Sibyl's authentic visions. The broader implications of the prophecy's fulfillment extended far beyond the specific events it had predicted, serving as confirmation that the first prophecy about Harry Potter remained active and unfulfilled. If Voldemort could return from apparent death stronger than before, then the ultimate confrontation between light and dark remained in the future, with stakes that were higher than anyone had previously imagined. The boy who had survived the killing curse as an infant would eventually face an enemy who had learned from defeat and emerged more terrible than ever. The magical community's initial reaction to news of Voldemort's return was characterized by denial and disbelief that reflected their deep psychological investment in believing that evil had been permanently defeated. The idea that their celebrations of victory had been premature was so threatening to their sense of security and accomplishment that many preferred to dismiss reports of the Dark Lord's resurrection as hysteria or attention-seeking, rather than face the implications of renewed conflict. But those who possessed the knowledge to interpret prophetic signs recognized that Sibyl's second vision had joined her first as authentic prophecy, whose fulfillment carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate events they described. The pattern was becoming clear. The divination professor, who had been dismissed by many as a fraud and charlatan, was in fact one of the most significant prophetic voices of her generation, whose visions shaped the destiny of the magical world in ways that scholars would study for centuries to come. The academic analysis of Sybil's second prophecy revealed layers of meaning that had not been apparent during its initial delivery. The description of Voldemort as alone and friendless suggested not just political isolation, but spiritual emptiness that came from pursuing power at the expense of all human connection. The reference to his servants' chains implied that loyalty based on fear and self-interest created its own forms of imprisonment, even for those who believed themselves free. Most significantly, the prediction of greater and more terrible return suggested that apparent defeat could become source of strength for those willing to learn from their failures. The preservation of this second prophecy followed protocols that had been established after the first, with multiple copies created and secured in different locations to prevent loss through accident or enemy action. The Department of Mysteries added it to their collection with the kind of reverent care reserved for artifacts of cosmic significance, while scholars began the process of comparative analysis that would reveal its connections to broader patterns of prophetic knowledge accumulated over centuries of careful study. The international magical community's response to confirmation that authentic prophecy was still being delivered in Britain created diplomatic complications that extended far beyond simple intelligence sharing. Other magical governments began requesting access to prophetic information that they considered relevant to their own security concerns, while some nations implemented immigration restrictions designed to prevent their populations from being drawn into conflicts that British seers had predicted would reshape the wizarding world. The psychological impact of validated prophecy on the British magical community was profound and lasting, forcing individuals and institutions to confront the reality that their futures were being shaped by forces beyond their immediate control or understanding. The comfortable assumption that they were masters of their own destiny was replaced by awareness that cosmic forces operated on scales too vast for human comprehension, using individual lives as instruments in conflicts whose significance transcended personal concerns. For Harry Potter himself, the fulfillment of Sybil's second prophecy served as stark reminder that his own prophetic destiny remained incomplete, and that the comfortable years of relative normalcy at Hogwarts had been merely preparation for confrontations that would test every lesson he had learned about courage, sacrifice, and the power of love to triumph over darkness. The boy who had survived one encounter with prophecy would soon discover that fate had additional trials prepared for him, challenges that would require everything he had learned and more than he believed himself capable of giving. The ripple effects of prophetic fulfillment continued to expand outward from their point of origin, touching lives and shaping events in ways both obvious and subtle, as if the very fabric of reality was adjusting itself to accommodate the return of forces that had been temporarily banished but never truly destroyed, preparing the stage for final confrontations that would determine whether light or darkness would ultimately prevail in the ancient struggle that prophecy had both revealed and set in motion. In the depths of the Forbidden Forest, where ancient magic pulses through root and branch with rhythms older than human memory, the centaur herd maintains vigil beneath stars, whose movements they read like sacred texts written across the vault of heaven. These noble beings, whose torsos rise from powerful equine bodies like living monuments to the fusion of earthly wisdom and celestial knowledge, possess forms of prophetic sight that differ fundamentally from the trance-induced visions experienced by human seers. Their divination flows from direct communion with cosmic forces that govern the movement of planets and the turning of seasons, creating prophecies that span centuries and shape the destiny of entire civilizations. The centaur approach to prophetic knowledge reflects their unique position as beings who exist simultaneously in the mundane world of forest and meadow and the ethereal realm of stellar influence and temporal mystery. Where human seers receive visions through traumatic episodes that separate them from ordinary consciousness, centaurs experience prophecy as a natural extension of their everyday awareness, their enhanced perception allowing them to discern patterns in the movement of celestial bodies that reveal the underlying structure of fate itself. Their prophecies emerge not from trance states, but from careful observation and interpretation of signs that lesser beings cannot perceive or understand. The star charts maintained by centaur astronomers represent centuries of accumulated knowledge about the relationship between celestial movements and terrestrial events, their calculations achieving levels of precision that surpass even the most sophisticated human magical instruments. These charts map not merely the positions of stars and planets, but the complex interactions between cosmic forces that create windows of prophetic possibility, moments when the barriers between present and future become permeable enough to allow glimpses of what is yet to come. The centaurs understand that prophecy is not random occurrence, but manifestation of natural laws that govern the flow of time itself. Bane, the centaur whose dark coat reflected his pessimistic nature, possessed abilities that allowed him to read disaster and conflict in stellar configurations that appeared peaceful to untrained observers. His interpretations of Mars's movements through the constellation of Leo had warned of wars decades before they erupted, while his analysis of Jupiter's conjunction with Saturn had predicted the rise of Dark Lords, whose names were not yet spoken by human tongues. The other centaurs respected his gift even when they found his pronouncements disturbing, understanding that accurate prophecy often brought unwelcome news about futures that mortals would prefer to avoid. Firenze, whose coat shone like polished silver in moonlight, approached divination with the patient wisdom that came from understanding that cosmic patterns revealed their secrets only to those willing to observe without judgment or personal investment in specific outcomes. His prophecies tended to focus on longer-term developments that would unfold over generations rather than immediate crises, his vision encompassing the vast sweep of historical change that human attention spans found difficult to comprehend. He had foreseen the eventual integration of magical and non-magical technologies, the discovery of new magical dimensions, and the emergence of hybrid beings whose existence would challenge traditional categories of magical classification. The centaur method of prophetic instruction differed dramatically from human educational approaches, involving years of silent observation before students were permitted to speak their first tentative interpretations of celestial signs. Young centaurs would spend decades learning to distinguish between significant astronomical events and mere coincidence, developing the kind of pattern recognition that allowed authentic prophecy to emerge from the vast complexity of stellar movements. The failure rate was high, as many candidates discovered that they lacked either the patience or the intellectual capacity necessary for true astronomical divination. The magical creatures of the wider world possessed their own forms of prophetic ability that operated through mechanisms entirely different from either human trance states or centaur stellar observation. Dragons, whose ancient lineages stretched back to the earliest days of magical evolution, carried genetic memories that included knowledge of future events encoded in their very DNA. These great beings could sense approaching changes in magical energy levels decades before such shifts became apparent to other creatures. Their prophetic abilities, manifesting through behavioral changes that knowledgeable observers could interpret as warnings about coming transformations. The phoenix, that most magical of all birds, demonstrated prophetic abilities through its unique relationship with cycles of death and rebirth that reflected cosmic patterns of destruction and renewal. Fawkes, Dumbledore's companion, had exhibited behavior that suggested awareness of his master's eventual fate, years before the events at Hogwarts reached their tragic culmination. The Phoenix's song carried undertones that trained listeners could interpret as prophetic communication, melodies that spoke of futures where sacrifice would be required to preserve what was most precious and where rebirth would emerge from apparent ending. Unicorns, those purest of magical creatures, possessed prophetic abilities that manifested through their legendary sensitivity to corruption and evil. Their flight from the Forbidden Forest in the years preceding Voldemort's return had been interpreted by those who understood their nature as clear warning about approaching darkness. Their departure, serving as early warning system that operated independently of human or centaur divination. The unicorn's prophecies were behavioral rather than verbal, communicated through actions that required no words to convey their essential meaning about the moral state of the world around them. The house elves, despite their servitude to wizard families, maintained prophetic traditions that had been passed down through generations of magical bondage, their abilities manifesting through dreams and visions that they were often forbidden to share with their masters. These humble beings possessed forms of domestic divination that focused on the immediate futures of the households they served, their prophecies typically concerning matters of family fortune, health, and harmony, rather than the grand cosmic events that occupied human and centaur seers. Yet their predictions were remarkably accurate within their limited scope, providing invaluable guidance about day-to-day matters that more dramatic forms of prophecy overlooked entirely. The goblins of Gringotts Wizarding Bank had developed prophetic abilities that were specifically attuned to matters of wealth, commerce, and the flow of magical resources through the economy. Their financial divination allowed them to predict market fluctuations, currency devaluations, and economic crises, with accuracy that made their banking services indispensable to the wizarding world. Goblin prophets could sense approaching recessions through changes in magical energy patterns that affected the value of enchanted objects, while their analysis of precious metal movements revealed information about political stability that conventional intelligence gathering could not match. The merpeople who inhabited the depths of magical lakes and seas possessed forms of prophetic ability that operated through their connection to water as both physical substance and symbolic representation of emotional and spiritual flow. Their prophecies emerged through changes in tidal patterns, the behavior of aquatic creatures, and the acoustic properties of underwater environments that revealed information about future events. The merpeople of the Black Lake had warned Hogwarts authorities about approaching dangers through songs that few humans could interpret, their voices carrying across the water, with messages that spoke of darkness, rising from the depths of human ambition and magical corruption. In the mountains of Scotland and Wales, the giants maintained prophetic traditions that were among the oldest in the magical world, their abilities stemming from direct connection to geological forces that operated on timescales measured in millennia rather than decades. Giant seers could predict earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and other geological catastrophes through their sensitivity to deep earth movements, while their awareness of long-term climate patterns allowed them to foresee environmental changes that would affect magical and non-magical populations alike. Their prophecies were often dismissed as too distant and abstract to be useful, but their accuracy over extended periods made them invaluable for understanding the largest patterns of change affecting the magical world. The werewolf community, despite their reputation for violence and unpredictability, possessed prophetic abilities that were closely tied to lunar cycles and the transformation process that defined their existence. Werewolf seers experienced visions during the periods surrounding full moon transformations, their prophecies focusing on matters of identity, transformation, and the struggle between civilized behavior and primal instinct. Their predictions often concerned the fate of individuals who were caught between different aspects of their nature, providing insights into the psychological and spiritual challenges that accompanied major life transitions. The vampire covens that existed on the margins of magical society maintained prophetic traditions that were focused on matters of death, immortality, and the passage of time across centuries of unchanging existence. Vampire seers possessed perspectives on prophecy that were impossible for mortal beings to achieve, their immortal nature allowing them to observe the fulfillment of predictions across time spans that exceeded normal human lifetimes. Their prophecies tended to concern the rise and fall of civilizations, the evolution of magical practices across centuries, and the long-term consequences of choices made by mortal beings who could not foresee the eventual results of their actions. The international magical communities had developed prophetic traditions that reflected their unique cultural perspectives and magical practices, creating forms of divination that were often incomprehensible to those raised in different magical traditions. The shamanic cultures of the Americas understood prophecy as communication with ancestral spirits who existed outside temporal boundaries, their visions emerging through ritual practices that involved careful preparation and the use of magical plants that enhanced natural prophetic abilities. These shamanic prophecies often concerned the relationship between human communities and the natural world, predicting environmental changes and social developments that would affect the balance between magical and non-magical populations. The magical traditions of Africa approached prophecy through drumming, dance, and ritual practices that induced collective trance states, allowing entire communities to share prophetic visions simultaneously. These communal prophecies focused on matters that affected the group rather than individuals, predicting tribal movements, seasonal changes, and the emergence of leaders whose actions would influence the destiny of their people. The accuracy of these collective visions was legendary, though their interpretation required cultural knowledge that outsiders found difficult to acquire or understand. In Asia, the magical communities had developed prophetic traditions that emphasized the interconnectedness of all things and the way individual actions created ripple effects that influenced events across vast distances and extended periods of time. Asian seers practiced forms of divination that involved meditation on the flow of magical energy through landscapes, their prophecies emerging from deep understanding of how cosmic forces manifested through geographical features and seasonal cycles. Their predictions often concerned the balance between opposing forces and the way harmony could be maintained through proper understanding of natural laws that governed both magical and mundane existence. The Nordic magical traditions approached prophecy through connection with ancient gods and spirits, whose existence predated the establishment of modern magical institutions, their visions emerging through ritual practices that involved journey to otherworldly realms where past, present, and future existed simultaneously. Nordic seers experienced prophecy as form of divine communication, their visions carrying the authority of cosmic forces that had shaped the world since its creation. Their predictions often concerned matters of honor, courage, and the way individual choices contributed to the great tapestries of fate that connected all living beings. The Australian magical communities possessed prophetic traditions that were among the oldest in the world, their abilities stemming from connection to Dreamtime mythologies that understood time as circular rather than linear phenomenon. Aboriginal magical practitioners experience prophecy as return to primordial states of consciousness, where the boundaries between dreaming and waking, past and future, self and cosmos dissolved entirely. Their visions often concerned the deep patterns that connected human society with the natural world, predicting changes in magical ecosystems and the emergence of new forms of magical creatures that would adapt to changing environmental conditions. The nomadic magical communities that existed between established national boundaries had developed prophetic traditions that emphasized movement, change, and the way migration patterns revealed information about future developments in regional politics and magical resource distribution. Nomadic seers experienced prophecy through their sensitivity to changes in magical energy levels across different geographical regions, their visions emerging from direct experience with the way magical forces varied according to location and seasonal cycles. Their predictions often concerned the rise and fall of magical governments, the discovery of new magical territories, and the emergence of trade routes that would connect previously isolated magical communities. The underground magical communities that had established themselves in cavern systems and subterranean cities possessed prophetic abilities that were attuned to geological processes and the way Earth movements revealed information about future changes in surface conditions. Subterranean seers experienced prophecy through their connection to deep Earth energies, their visions emerging from meditation on mineral formations and underground water flows that carried information about surface weather patterns and political developments. Their predictions often concerned environmental disasters, the discovery of new magical resources, and the way surface conflicts would affect underground populations. The maritime magical communities that lived on islands and floating cities had developed prophetic traditions that emphasized the relationship between oceanic currents and the flow of magical energy across global distances. Maritime seers experienced prophecy through their sensitivity to changes in tidal patterns and sea temperatures that revealed information about future weather developments and the movement of magical creatures across oceanic boundaries. Their predictions often concerned international trade, the discovery of new magical islands, and the way climate changes would affect global magical ecosystems. The aerial magical communities that had established themselves in mountain peaks and floating structures possessed prophetic abilities that were connected to atmospheric conditions and the way weather patterns reflected broader cosmic forces. Aerial seers experienced prophecy through their observation of cloud formations, wind patterns, and atmospheric electrical phenomena that carried information about future developments in terrestrial affairs. Their predictions often concerned the outcome of conflicts between ground-based magical communities, the emergence of new forms of flying creatures, and the way atmospheric changes would affect global magical communications. The synthesis of these diverse prophetic traditions created a global network of interconnected divination that provided comprehensive coverage of future possibilities affecting the magical world, each tradition contributing unique perspectives and specialized knowledge that complemented the insights provided by other forms of prophetic ability. The challenge for magical leaders was learning to interpret the complex symphony of predictions that emerged from this network, understanding how different types of prophecy related to each other, and what their combined messages revealed about the future of magical civilization. The academic study of comparative prophecy had become a specialized field within magical scholarship, with researchers attempting to identify common patterns and underlying principles that governed all forms of divination regardless of their cultural origins or species-specific characteristics. These studies revealed that authentic prophecy, regardless of its source, shared certain fundamental characteristics that distinguished it from mere speculation or wishful thinking, including specific types of temporal resonance, characteristic patterns of linguistic structure, and measurable effects on local magical energy levels. The practical applications of multi-species prophetic knowledge had proven invaluable during periods of crisis, when single sources of divination provided insufficient warning about approaching dangers or incomplete information about appropriate responses to emerging threats. The coordination between human, centaur, and other forms of prophetic ability had been crucial during both wizarding wars, providing strategic intelligence that no single tradition could have achieved alone, while revealing vulnerabilities in enemy plans that conventional military intelligence had failed to detect. The preservation and protection of diverse prophetic traditions had become a priority for international magical cooperation, as scholars recognized that the loss of any single approach to divination would impoverish the entire global network of prophetic knowledge. Cultural exchange programs allowed seers from different traditions to learn from each other while maintaining the integrity of their own cultural practices, creating hybrid approaches to prophecy that combined the strengths of multiple traditions while avoiding the weaknesses that limited any single method of divination. As our journey through these varied streams of prophetic wisdom draws toward peaceful contemplation, let your mind rest in the knowledge that throughout the magical world, countless beings watch and listen for the whispers of tomorrow, each contributing their unique gifts to the vast tapestry of foresight that guides civilization away from darkness and toward the light of understanding that illuminates all paths through time. The threads of destiny that had been woven through centuries of prophetic utterance began to converge in the final years of the 20th century, as the wizarding world found itself caught between the weight of ancient predictions and the terrible freedom of choices yet unmade. The prophecies that had shaped magical civilization for generations were approaching their moments of fulfillment, creating a cosmic tension that could be felt by anyone sensitive to the deeper currents of magical energy that flowed through the foundations of reality itself. Yet even as these predetermined patterns pressed toward their inevitable conclusions, the eternal question that had plagued philosophers and seers alike remained unanswered. Were these futures truly fixed, or did the very act of prophecy create possibilities that choice and courage might still alter? The first great test of this fundamental tension came with the return of Lord Voldemort, whose resurrection had been foretold in Sybil Trelawney's second prophecy, with such precision that every detail unfolded exactly as her vision had predicted. The Dark Lord who emerged from the graveyard ritual at Little Hangleton was indeed greater and more terrible than before, his apparent death having taught him lessons about power and survival that transformed him from merely dangerous wizard into something approaching force of nature. Yet his very return raised profound questions about the nature of prophetic inevitability, for his defeat 13 years earlier had also been prophesied, suggesting that prophecy might describe cycles rather than endpoints, patterns that repeated until some deeper resolution was achieved. Voldemort himself had become perhaps the most complex example of the relationship between prophecy and free will, his entire existence shaped by attempts to circumvent or control the predictions that seemed to govern his fate. The partial prophecy he had received from Severus Snape had driven him to seek out and attempt to destroy the infant Harry Potter, but his incomplete knowledge had led him to fulfill the very conditions that made the prophecy specific to his chosen target. In trying to prevent his own downfall, he had created the circumstances that ensured it, demonstrating the cruel irony that often characterized the relationship between knowledge of the future and attempts to alter it. The Dark Lord's obsession with prophecy had only deepened following his resurrection, as he sought to understand how his previous defeat had been possible and what other predictions might threaten his renewed ambitions. His agents scoured the wizarding world for seers and prophetic artifacts, attempting to gather intelligence about potential futures that might contain information about his vulnerabilities or the identities of those who might oppose him. This quest for prophetic knowledge revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of how divination actually functioned, as he treated prophecies like strategic intelligence that could be collected and analyzed rather than manifestations of cosmic forces that operated beyond mortal comprehension or control. The Ministry of Magic's response to authenticated prophecy demonstrated similar misconceptions about the nature of fate and destiny, as bureaucratic minds attempted to apply administrative solutions to mysteries that transcended human institutions. The Department of Mysteries had been tasked with studying and protecting prophetic knowledge, but their approach treated prophecies as valuable commodities rather than sacred communications from forces beyond ordinary magical experience. Their elaborate security measures could protect prophecy orbs from theft, but they could not prevent the fulfillment of the visions those orbs contained, creating an illusion of control that masked deeper helplessness in the face of cosmic inevitability. The battle that erupted in the Department of Mysteries during Harry Potter's 5th year at Hogwarts provided a dramatic demonstration of how prophecy shaped events, even as those events seemed to unfold through individual choices and random chance. Harry's vision of Sirius Black being tortured had compelled him to attempt a rescue mission that led directly to the Hall of Prophecy, where the orb containing his own prophetic destiny waited in its precisely labeled alcove. The sequence of events that brought him to that moment appeared to result from personal decisions and emotional responses, yet every step had been guided by forces that operated beyond conscious awareness or rational planning. The destruction of Harry's prophecy orb during the battle created a moment of profound symbolic significance that revealed deep truths about the relationship between knowledge and destiny. The physical vessel that had contained the prediction of his fate was shattered, its crystalline fragments scattered across the department's polished floors like broken dreams of certainty and control. Yet the prophecy itself survived in Dumbledore's memory, suggesting that the true power of prophetic knowledge lay not in its preservation, but in its communication to those who needed to understand their roles in cosmic patterns too vast for individual comprehension. Dumbledore's decision to finally share the prophecy's complete contents with Harry represented a crucial moment in the ongoing tension between predetermined fate and conscious choice. The aged wizard understood that knowledge of one's prophetic destiny could be either liberating or paralyzing, depending on how that information was received and interpreted. His careful explanation emphasized that prophecy had power only to the extent that people chose to believe in and act upon it, suggesting that even the most specific predictions remained subject to the choices made by those they described. Yet, even as Dumbledore spoke of choice and free will, the events unfolding around them seemed to follow the prophecy's outline with inexorable precision. Harry's development as a wizard and as a person proceeded along lines that prepared him for the confrontation that the vision had foretold, his experiences and relationships shaping him into someone capable of fulfilling the prophetic role that had been assigned to him before his birth. The training he received, the allies he gathered, and the sacrifices he witnessed all contributed to his preparation for a destiny that seemed simultaneously chosen and inevitable. The discovery that Harry carried a fragment of Voldemort's soul within himself added layers of complexity to questions about prophetic fulfillment and the nature of choice within predetermined patterns. The Horcrux that had been accidentally created during the failed killing curse represented an unintended consequence that the original prophecy had not explicitly addressed, yet its existence proved crucial to understanding how the prediction would ultimately be fulfilled. The connection between Harry and Voldemort that resulted from this soul fragment created possibilities for sacrifice and redemption that transcended the simple confrontation that the prophecy's words seemed to describe. The philosophical implications of accidental Horcrux creation raised fundamental questions about whether prophecies described fixed futures or merely probable outcomes based on current magical and psychological conditions. If Voldemort's attempt to kill baby Harry had succeeded completely, the prophecy would never have been fulfilled, suggesting that prophetic visions might be conditional rather than absolute. Alternatively, the creation of the Horcrux might have been part of the cosmic pattern that the prophecy had glimpsed, indicating that even seemingly random events were guided by forces operating beyond ordinary causation. The role of love as the power that Voldemort could not understand provided perhaps the most significant example of how free will operated within prophetic frameworks. Lily Potter's sacrifice for her infant son had been a choice made in the moment of crisis, driven by maternal instinct and moral conviction, rather than strategic planning or prophetic knowledge. Yet this spontaneous act of love had created magical protections that would prove crucial to the prophecy's eventual fulfillment, suggesting that the most important choices were often those made without awareness of their cosmic significance. The extension of this protective power through Harry's own sacrificial choice during the final battle demonstrated how individual decisions could amplify and redirect prophetic energies in ways that even the most detailed visions could not have predicted. Harry's willingness to die for his friends and family created magical protections for them that mirrored those his mother had provided for him, showing how patterns established by prophecy could be transformed and expanded through conscious moral action. The choice to sacrifice himself paradoxically ensured his survival, fulfilling the prophecy's requirement that one must die at the hand of the other, while transcending the apparent limitation that seemed to make survival impossible. The temporary nature of Harry's death and his subsequent return to life raised profound questions about the finality of prophetic fulfillment and whether cosmic patterns might allow for redemption and resurrection, even within the framework of predetermined destiny. His experience in the ethereal King's Cross station, where he encountered Dumbledore's spirit and was given the choice to continue on or return to life, suggested that prophecies might describe necessary experiences rather than inevitable endings, allowing for transformation and growth, even within the context of seemingly tragic predictions. Voldemort's final defeat represented the ultimate demonstration of how prophecy and free will intersected in ways that transcended simple categories of fate and choice. His death came not through Harry's use of a killing curse, but through the rebound of his own murderous intent, suggesting that the prophecy's fulfillment required not the triumph of good over evil, but the self-destruction of evil through its own inherent contradictions. The Dark Lord's inability to understand love, remorse, or sacrifice ultimately proved to be his downfall, as these emotional and moral limitations prevented him from grasping the true nature of the forces arrayed against him. The aftermath of the prophecy's fulfillment revealed that cosmic patterns continued to operate even after their apparent completion, as the choices made during the final confrontation created ripple effects that would influence the magical world for generations to come. Harry's survival and Voldemort's destruction established new possibilities for magical society, but these possibilities still required conscious choices and sustained effort to become reality. The prophecy had created conditions for change, but the actual transformation of magical civilization remained dependent on decisions made by individuals who understood that freedom required constant vigilance and moral commitment. The broader implications of prophetic fulfillment extended throughout the magical world, as communities that had been shaped by centuries of predictive knowledge struggled to understand their roles in post-prophetic reality. The Centaurs adjusted their astronomical observations to account for changes in cosmic patterns that reflected the completion of major prophetic cycles, while magical creatures throughout Britain exhibited behaviors that suggested awareness of fundamental shifts in the balance between light and darkness. Even the ancient stones of Hogwarts, seemed to resonate with different frequencies, as if the castle itself recognized that an era of prophetic tension had ended and a new age of possibility was beginning. The study of prophetic fulfillment became a specialized field within magical scholarship, as researchers attempted to understand how the complex interplay between prediction and choice had produced outcomes that satisfied prophetic requirements while transcending their apparent limitations. These studies revealed that the most significant prophecies were often fulfilled through means that no one had anticipated, suggesting that cosmic forces possessed forms of creativity and adaptability that allowed predetermined patterns to manifest through infinite variations of individual choice and circumstance. The psychological impact of living through prophetic fulfillment affected not only those directly mentioned in the visions, but entire communities that had organized their lives around expectations of particular futures. The validation of Sybil Trelawney's prophecies created new respect for divination as authentic magical discipline, while also raising troubling questions about the extent to which individual agency might be constrained by cosmic forces beyond human understanding or control. The tension between gratitude for prophetic guidance and resentment at prophetic limitation would influence magical philosophy and ethics for generations to come. The international magical community's response to documented prophetic fulfillment created diplomatic complexities that reflected different cultural attitudes toward fate, destiny, and individual responsibility. Some magical societies viewed the events in Britain as validation of their own prophetic traditions, while others saw them as dangerous precedents that might encourage excessive reliance on divination at the expense of rational planning and moral decision-making. The debates that emerged from these different perspectives would shape international magical cooperation and competition for decades as various communities struggled to balance prophetic wisdom with practical governance. The educational implications of proven prophecy forced magical schools throughout the world to reconsider their approaches to divination instruction, as the events surrounding Harry Potter's life had demonstrated that authentic prophetic ability could have consequences that extended far beyond academic theory. The challenge for educators was developing curricula that honored the reality of prophetic power, while helping students understand that knowledge of the future carried responsibilities that required careful moral preparation and psychological support. The long-term effects of prophetic fulfillment on magical law and governance created precedents that would influence legal systems for centuries to come. Questions about the extent to which prophetic knowledge could be used as evidence in criminal proceedings, the responsibilities of seers to report visions of future crimes, and the rights of individuals mentioned in prophecies to protection from those who might seek to prevent or exploit predicted outcomes, all required new approaches to jurisprudence that balanced prophetic reality with principles of justice and individual liberty. The preservation of prophetic knowledge for future generations became a priority that transcended national boundaries, as magical communities recognized that their survival might depend on understanding patterns that operated across centuries or millennia of historical development. The establishment of international archives and research centers dedicated to prophetic study created new opportunities for comparative analysis, while raising questions about who should have access to knowledge that could influence the destiny of entire civilizations. The emergence of new prophetic voices in the aftermath of major fulfillment cycles suggested that cosmic patterns continued to evolve, and that future generations would face their own challenges requiring prophetic guidance and individual courage. Young seers began reporting visions that seemed to describe possibilities rather than inevitabilities, as if the successful navigation of previous prophetic crises had created more flexible relationships between fate and choice. that allowed for greater individual agency within cosmic patterns. The gradual recognition that prophecy and free will were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of a larger reality that encompassed both predetermined patterns and creative possibility, transformed magical philosophy in ways that would influence every aspect of wizarding life. The understanding that individuals could choose how to fulfill their destinies, even when those destinies were clearly foretold, created new possibilities for moral growth and spiritual development that honored both cosmic wisdom and human dignity. As the echoes of fulfilled prophecy gradually faded into the peaceful rhythms of post-conflict life, the magical world settled into contemplation of mysteries that had been revealed and questions that remained unanswered. Understanding that the dance between fate and freedom would continue as long as conscious beings sought to understand their place in patterns too vast for complete comprehension, yet intimate enough to touch every choice made with love, courage, in the service of light. The night of June 18th, 1996, descended upon London with the weight of accumulated destiny pressing down through layers of magical concealment that surrounded the Ministry of Magic like invisible armor. Deep beneath the city's bustling streets, where the Department of Mysteries maintained its eternal vigil over forces too dangerous for ordinary comprehension, the Hall of Prophecy stood in its customary twilight silence, thousands of crystalline orbs floating in their precise positions like captured stars holding fragments of tomorrow within their delicate shells. None who walked those shadowed corridors that evening could have imagined that they were about to witness the physical destruction of prophetic knowledge and the symbolic shattering of certainties that had shaped the magical world for generations. The events that would culminate in battle among the prophecy shelves had begun with a vision that was itself a form of prophecy, though its source was not Sybil Trelawney's inner eye but the corrupted connection between Harry Potter's mind and Voldemort's consciousness. The image of Sirius Black being tortured in the Department of Mysteries had struck Harry with the force of divine revelation, compelling him toward action with an urgency that transcended rational thought or careful planning. The vision carried all the hallmarks of authentic prophetic experience: the sense of absolute certainty, the compulsion to act, and the terrible clarity that made questioning or delay seem impossible. Yet, this false prophecy, born from Voldemort's manipulation rather than cosmic insight, would prove more effective at driving events toward their destined conclusion than any authentic vision could have achieved. The Dark Lord's understanding of Harry's psychological weaknesses and emotional vulnerabilities allowed him to craft a deception that exploited the very qualities that made the young wizard heroic: his loyalty to those he loved, his willingness to sacrifice himself for others, and his inability to ignore suffering even when helping might be dangerous or impossible. The journey to the ministry that night involved 6 students whose presence would prove crucial to the events that followed, each bringing unique abilities and perspectives that would influence the battle's outcome in ways that neither side could have anticipated. Harry Potter carried with him not only his prophetic destiny, but also the emotional intensity that made him vulnerable to manipulation, while his companions brought their own strengths and limitations to a confrontation that would test everything they had learned about courage, loyalty, and the price of heroism. Luna Lovegood's presence in the group carried particular significance that extended beyond her usefulness in battle, as her unique relationship with reality and extraordinary perceptiveness about hidden truths would prove essential during moments when conventional wisdom and normal magical training were insufficient guides to action. Her ability to see through deception and illusion, combined with her acceptance of possibilities that others dismissed as impossible, made her an invaluable ally in an environment where the boundaries between truth and falsehood, past and future, became increasingly blurred. The approach to the Department of Mysteries required navigating security measures that had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of unauthorized intrusion that the students were attempting, yet the magical protection seemed to part before them with suspicious ease. The lifts that should have required authorization codes functioned normally, while the corridor that led to the department's entrance remained mysteriously unguarded despite the late hour and the sensitive nature of the research conducted within. These apparent security failures were actually elements of Voldemort's elaborate trap, designed to guide his targets toward the specific location where his agents waited in concealment. The circular room at the department's heart, with its dozen identical doors and its disorienting lack of windows or obvious landmarks, served as both psychological warfare and practical containment system. The students found themselves in a space that challenged their sense of direction and spatial awareness while preventing easy escape once they had committed to entering the department's inner chambers. The room's magical properties, designed to confuse intruders and protect sensitive research areas, worked exactly as intended to funnel the young wizards toward the Hall of Prophecy, where their true test awaited. The first glimpse of the Hall of Prophecy struck the students with a combination of awe and apprehension that reflected their intuitive understanding of the sacred nature of the space they were entering. The vast circular chamber stretched beyond the limits of normal sight, its towering shelves disappearing into darkness above, while the floor extended in all directions like a sea of polished stone that reflected light from sources that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The thousands of prophecy orbs that floated in their assigned positions created an atmosphere of hushed reverence, as if the students had entered a cathedral dedicated to the worship of time itself. The search for Sirius among the prophecy shelves revealed the magnitude of prophetic knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries of careful collection and preservation. Each orb contained visions that had shaped the destiny of individuals, families, and entire civilizations, their contents representing the hopes, fears, and inevitable conclusions of countless lives that had been touched by the gift of foresight. The students moved through this repository of tomorrow's secrets with the uncomfortable awareness that they were surrounded by futures both wonderful and terrible, most of which would never be witnessed by those they concerned. The discovery of Harry's own prophecy, labeled with his name in script that seemed to shimmer with temporal energy, marked the moment when the evening's events shifted from rescue mission to direct confrontation with destiny itself. The orb that contained the prediction of his fate floated in its alcove like a crystallized fragment of cosmic intention, its presence both invitation and warning to someone who had lived his entire life under the shadow of prophetic expectation. The temptation to grasp the orb and finally learn the complete contents of the vision that had shaped his existence was almost overwhelming, yet some deeper instinct warned him that such knowledge came with prices that could not be calculated in advance. The magical properties that prevented unauthorized handling of prophecy orbs became apparent as soon as Harry attempted to remove his own prediction from its resting place. The burning sensation that spread through his fingers and up his arm was not mere physical discomfort, but a warning from forces that understood the dangerous nature of prophetic knowledge and the psychological damage that could result from premature exposure to one's own destiny. Only those specifically mentioned in prophecies could safely handle the orbs that contained their fates, while unauthorized contact resulted in increasingly severe consequences that could include permanent magical damage or complete loss of sanity. The appearance of Lucius Malfoy and his Death Eater companions transformed the Hall of Prophecy from sacred repository into battlefield their presence revealing the trap that had been carefully laid to exploit Harry's emotional vulnerabilities and draw him into direct confrontation with Voldemort's agents. The Death Eaters moved through the prophecy shelves with the casual confidence of those who believed themselves in complete control of the situation, their masks and dark robes creating an atmosphere of menace that stood in sharp contrast to the sacred nature of their surroundings. Lucius Malfoy's demand that Harry surrender the prophecy orb revealed the depth of Voldemort's obsession with prophetic knowledge and his fundamental misunderstanding of how divination actually functioned. The Dark Lord believed that possession of the physical orb would give him access to strategic intelligence that could be analyzed and exploited like conventional military information, failing to understand that prophecies were not mere predictions, but manifestations of cosmic forces that operated beyond mortal comprehension or control. His agents had been instructed to obtain the prophecy at any cost, but they lacked the philosophical framework necessary to understand what they were truly seeking or why their quest was ultimately futile. The battle that erupted among the prophecy shelves was unlike any magical combat that had previously occurred within the Ministry's walls, as the combatants fought not only against each other, but against the consequences of their actions, for the prophetic knowledge that surrounded them. Every spell that missed its intended target threatened to strike prophecy orbs whose destruction would eliminate forever the visions they contained, while the magical energies released by the conflict created resonances that interfered with the delicate temporal fields that kept the orbs stable in their floating positions. The destruction of prophecy orbs during the battle created cascades of temporal energy that manifested as brief glimpses of the futures that had been lost, spectral visions that flickered through the hall like ghosts of possibilities that would never be realized. Each shattered orb released its contained prophecy into the immediate environment, creating a chaos of overlapping visions that showed fragments of individual destinies, political upheavals, and cosmic transformations that spanned centuries of potential history. The students and Death Eaters alike found themselves momentarily overwhelmed by exposure to prophetic knowledge that their minds were not equipped to process safely. The running battle through multiple levels of the department exposed the young wizards to dangers that extended far beyond the immediate threat posed by their pursuers, as they encountered research areas where experiments with time, space, and consciousness had created environmental hazards that could prove fatal to anyone who lacked proper training and protective equipment. The Time Room, with its collection of time turners and experimental temporal manipulation devices, created fields of accelerated and decelerated time that could age or reverse the physical development of anyone caught within their influence. The space chamber contained dimensional rifts and pocket realities that could trap visitors in alternate versions of reality from which escape might prove impossible. The brain room presented psychological dangers that were perhaps more terrifying than any physical threat, as the preserved brains that floated in their tanks of mysterious fluid possessed forms of consciousness that could overwhelm unprepared minds with alien thoughts and incomprehensible knowledge. Ron Weasley's encounter with the brain tentacles that wrapped around his arms and attempted to penetrate his consciousness provided a stark demonstration of how intellectual curiosity could become dangerous when applied to mysteries that human minds were not designed to comprehend. The arrival of Order of the Phoenix members in response to the alarm raised by the students' presence marked a turning point in the battle, as experienced adult wizards brought tactical knowledge and magical abilities that had been refined through years of combat against dark arts practitioners. The reinforcements included some of the most skilled magical combatants of their generation, individuals whose understanding of advanced defensive and offensive magic allowed them to engage Death Eaters on equal terms while protecting the students who had become caught in the crossfire of adult conflicts. Sirius Black's participation in the battle carried particular emotional weight for Harry, as it seemed to validate the vision that had compelled him to undertake the rescue mission in the first place. The sight of his godfather fighting alongside Order members against the Death Eaters who had allegedly been torturing him created a sense of vindication that made the evening's dangers seem worthwhile, even as more experienced observers recognized troubling inconsistencies in the situation that suggested complications beyond those immediately apparent. The duel between Sirius Black and Bellatrix Lestrange represented the collision of personal history with political conflict, as family members who had chosen opposing sides in the magical world's ideological struggle faced each other with wands drawn and no possibility of reconciliation or mercy. Their combat was informed by decades of accumulated grievance and philosophical disagreement, their spells carrying not only magical force, but emotional intensity that made their confrontation as much personal vendetta as military engagement. The moment of Sirius's death, as Bellatrix's curse struck him and sent him falling backward through the mysterious veil that separated the world of the living from whatever lay beyond, marked the culmination of prophetic manipulation and the terrible price of Harry's emotional vulnerability to false visions. The loss was devastating not only for its immediate emotional impact, but for what it revealed about the sophisticated nature of Voldemort's psychological warfare and his willingness to exploit love and loyalty as weapons against those who opposed him. Harry's grief and rage in response to his godfather's death created the emotional intensity necessary for Voldemort to attempt direct possession, as the Dark Lord sought to use the young wizard's pain as a pathway into his consciousness. The possession attempt represented a form of prophetic fulfillment that neither side had anticipated, as it brought Harry and Voldemort into direct mental contact that allowed each to experience the other's thoughts and emotions with unprecedented intimacy and clarity. The failure of Voldemort's possession attempt due to Harry's capacity for love provided dramatic validation of the prophecy's reference to power that the Dark Lord could not understand, as the very emotions that had made Harry vulnerable to manipulation also provided him with protections that transcended conventional magical defenses. The Dark Lord's inability to maintain control over someone whose consciousness was filled with love, loss, and compassion demonstrated the fundamental limitations of power based solely on fear and domination. The destruction of Harry's prophecy orb during the final moments of the battle created a moment of profound symbolic significance that marked the end of one phase of prophetic influence and the beginning of another. The shattering of the crystalline sphere that had contained the prediction of his destiny eliminated the physical vessel that had preserved the vision for 16 years, its fragments scattering across the department's floors like broken pieces of predetermined fate. Yet the prophecy itself survived in memory and consciousness, suggesting that the true power of prophetic knowledge lay not in its preservation as artifact, but in its integration into living awareness. The aftermath of the battle revealed the extent of damage that had been inflicted not only on the combatants, but on the prophetic knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries of careful collection and study. Hundreds of prophecy orbs had been destroyed during the fighting, their contents lost forever in explosions of temporal energy that created brief windows into futures that would never be realized. The Hall of Prophecy, which had maintained its serene perfection for generations, lay in ruins that testified to the destructive power of human conflict when allowed to intrude upon sacred spaces. The Ministry's response to the battle demonstrated the complex relationship between political authority and prophetic knowledge, as officials struggled to balance their responsibilities for protecting sensitive magical research with their need to control information that could influence public perception of the war against Voldemort. The destruction of so much prophetic material created intelligence gaps that would affect strategic planning for years to come, while the revelation that the Department of Mysteries could be successfully infiltrated and damaged raised troubling questions about the security of other sensitive magical installations. The international magical community's reaction to news of the battle reflected deep concerns about the stability of prophetic knowledge preservation and the implications of widespread destruction of future site materials. Diplomatic communications between magical governments increased in urgency as officials sought to understand whether similar attacks might be planned against their own prophetic archives and what defensive measures might be necessary to protect accumulated divination materials from those who would use them for destructive purposes. The psychological impact of witnessing prophecy orb destruction extended beyond those who had participated directly in the battle, as magical scholars and seers throughout the world reported dreams and visions that seemed to reflect the trauma inflicted on prophetic knowledge itself. The loss of so many contained visions created ripple effects through the network of interconnected divination that influenced magical communities across multiple continents, suggesting that prophetic knowledge existed in forms that transcended its physical preservation in crystalline vessels. The rebuilding of the Hall of Prophecy required not only architectural restoration, but the development of new preservation techniques and security measures that could protect prophetic knowledge from future attacks while maintaining its accessibility to those who needed guidance about their destinies. The new designs incorporated lessons learned from the battle, including enhanced protective enchantments, emergency preservation protocols, and alternative storage methods that would prevent the complete loss of prophetic materials, even if physical vessels were destroyed. The emergence of new prophetic voices in the aftermath of the battle suggested that cosmic forces were adapting to the loss of accumulated divination knowledge by inspiring additional seers whose visions could replace some of what had been destroyed. These new prophecies often focused on themes of rebuilding, renewal, and the importance of preserving wisdom for future generations, as if the universe itself recognized the need to restore balance after such extensive destruction of future site materials. The long-term implications of the battle for magical education included increased emphasis on the importance of prophecy preservation and the development of specialized training programs for those who would be responsible for protecting divination materials in the future. Students throughout the magical world learned about the events at the ministry as cautionary tales about the consequences of allowing political conflicts to intrude upon sacred spaces where knowledge of tomorrow was carefully maintained for the benefit of all magical civilization. As the dust settled and the immediate consequences of the battle became clear, the magical world began the slow process of understanding what had been lost and what had been learned from this collision between political ambition and prophetic wisdom, recognizing that the destruction of so much accumulated future knowledge represented not just tactical setback, but spiritual tragedy that would influence magical development for generations to come. The ripples that spread outward from the fulfillment of the great prophecies of the 20th century touched every corner of magical civilization with transformative force, reshaping institutions, relationships, and fundamental assumptions about the nature of fate and freedom that had governed wizarding society for centuries. Like stones cast into still water, the consequences of Harry Potter's triumph over Voldemort and the validation of Sybil Trelawney's prophetic abilities created expanding circles of change that would influence magical development for generations to come, altering not only how wizards understood prophecy, but how they approached governance, education, international relations, and the eternal questions about destiny and choice that had occupied philosophical minds since the earliest days of magical consciousness. The immediate aftermath of the Second Wizarding War saw the British Ministry of Magic struggling to comprehend the implications of documented prophetic fulfillment for their approach to magical governance and social policy. For centuries, The ministry had operated on the assumption that political decisions could be made through rational analysis of current conditions and probable outcomes, treating divination as interesting but unreliable adjunct to conventional planning, rather than source of authentic strategic intelligence. The precise fulfillment of every detail in Sybil's prophecies forced a fundamental reconsideration of these assumptions, as officials recognized that ignoring prophetic knowledge might mean overlooking crucial information about threats and opportunities that conventional analysis could never detect. The Department of Mysteries underwent the most dramatic transformation of any ministry division, as the destruction of the Hall of Prophecy and the validation of authentic prophecy created simultaneous crises of lost knowledge and expanded responsibility. The unspeakables who had devoted their careers to studying prophetic materials found themselves tasked with rebuilding their collection, while developing entirely new approaches to the preservation and interpretation of divination that the bays reflected hard-won understanding of prophecy's power and fragility. The new Hall of Prophecy, constructed with enhanced security measures and revolutionary preservation techniques, became a symbol of the magical world's renewed respect for prophetic knowledge and determination to protect it from those who would use such wisdom for destructive purposes. The international diplomatic implications of Britain's prophetic experiences created unprecedented challenges for magical foreign relations, as governments throughout the world struggled to understand how authentic prophecy might affect their own national interests and security concerns. The precise fulfillment of predictions about Voldemort's defeat had demonstrated that some prophecies described inevitable outcomes rather than mere possibilities, raising troubling questions about whether similar visions might exist that concerned international conflicts, economic developments, or social transformations that could destabilize entire regions of magical civilization. The French Ministry of Magic initiated a comprehensive review of their own prophetic archives, seeking to identify any visions that might have predicted or could influence their relationship with post-war Britain. Their scholars discovered references to the island nation's great trial by fire in 17th century prophecies that had been dismissed as overly dramatic metaphors, but now appeared to have described the wizarding wars with remarkable accuracy. These findings prompted increased cooperation with British authorities and the establishment of joint research programs designed to study how ancient prophecies might contain information about contemporary challenges. The American Magical Congress faced different but equally complex challenges in responding to developments across the Atlantic, as their own prophetic traditions had predicted the rise of a chosen child of the Eastern lands, whose victory would herald new possibilities for magical cooperation between continents. The validation of Harry Potter as authentic prophetic figure created opportunities for enhanced diplomatic relations, but it also raised concerns about whether American independence from European magical influences might be threatened by prophetic forces that operated beyond national boundaries. The German magical government's reaction was perhaps the most complex of all, as their recent historical experience with Grindelwald's rise and fall had created deep suspicions about charismatic leaders who claimed prophetic legitimacy for their actions. The careful analysis of Harry Potter's role in recent events eventually satisfied German concerns that he represented genuine heroism rather than dangerous megalomaniacal ambition. But the investigation process revealed how traumatic experiences with Dark Lords could influence entire national approaches to prophetic interpretation and validation. The educational implications of proven prophecy forced magical schools throughout the world to reconsider their approaches to divination instruction, as the events surrounding Harry Potter's life had demonstrated that prophetic ability could have consequences that extended far beyond academic theory into matters of life, death, and civilizational survival. Hogwarts School became the epicenter of these educational reforms, with Sybil Trelawney's transformation from marginalized figure of mild ridicule to respected prophet whose visions had shaped historical events, creating new expectations for how divination should be taught and who should be qualified to teach it. The curriculum changes that followed included increased emphasis on the historical significance of major prophecies, practical training in recognizing authentic prophetic experiences, and psychological preparation for the unique stresses associated with possessing or encountering genuine seer abilities. Students learned not only theoretical frameworks for understanding divination, but also ethical principles that governed the responsible use of prophetic knowledge and the moral obligations that accompanied glimpses of future events. The goal was to produce graduates who could distinguish between authentic prophecy and mere fortune-telling, while understanding the profound responsibilities that came with access to knowledge about tomorrow's possibilities. Beauxbaton's Academy of Magic developed specialized programs for students who showed signs of prophetic ability, recognizing that such individuals required different forms of education and support than those possessed of more conventional magical talents. The French approach emphasized the artistic and cultural dimensions of prophecy, teaching students to understand their visions as part of larger patterns of cultural and historical development, rather than isolated predictions about individual fates. This perspective proved particularly valuable for students whose prophecies concerned social movements, artistic innovations, and cultural transformations that operated on timescales measured in decades rather than years. Durmstrang Institute implemented more militaristic approaches to prophetic education that reflected their traditional emphasis on practical magical application and strategic thinking. Students with seer abilities were trained to understand their visions as intelligence assets that could influence political and military planning, while those without prophetic gifts learned to evaluate and utilize prophetic information provided by others. The Durmstrang approach proved controversial among other magical educational institutions, as critics argued that treating prophecy as military intelligence ignored its sacred nature and could encourage the kind of prophetic manipulation that had characterized Voldemort's activities. The development of international standards for prophetic education created opportunities for cooperation between magical schools, while raising difficult questions about cultural differences in understanding divination and its proper role in magical society. The establishment of exchange programs allowed students to experience different approaches to prophetic instruction, while international conferences brought together educators from around the world to share best practices and develop common frameworks for identifying and nurturing authentic seer abilities. The economic implications of validated prophecy created entirely new industries and investment strategies throughout the magical world, as businesses sought to capitalize on the proven reality of predictive knowledge, while investors attempted to identify prophetic insights that might provide advantages in commercial competition. The establishment of prophetic consulting firms created new career opportunities for individuals with authentic seer abilities, while the development of prophetic verification services provided methods for distinguishing genuine visions from fraudulent claims. The Gringotts Wizarding Bank developed sophisticated systems for evaluating prophetic information as it related to long-term investment planning, understanding that accurate knowledge about future political developments, resource discoveries, and technological innovations could provide enormous advantages for their clients, while creating new forms of fiduciary responsibility. The Goblin economists, who specialized in prophetic analysis, became some of the most sought-after advisors in the magical financial world. their ability to distinguish between authentic predictions and wishful thinking, proving invaluable for investors who sought to benefit from prophetic knowledge without falling victim to prophetic fraud. The insurance industry underwent similar transformations as companies struggled to understand how prophetic knowledge might affect their assessment of risks and calculation of premiums. Policies covering magical accidents, curse damage, and premature death all required reconsideration in light of the possibility that some clients might possess prophetic knowledge about their own futures or those of their beneficiaries. The development of ethical guidelines for the use of prophetic information in insurance decisions became a major focus for regulatory authorities who sought to balance commercial interests with individual privacy rights and the sacred nature of prophetic knowledge. The legal system's response to authenticated prophecy created precedents that would influence magical jurisprudence for centuries to come, as courts struggled with questions about the admissibility of prophetic evidence, the responsibilities of seers to report visions of future crimes, and the rights of individuals mentioned in prophecies to protection from those who might seek to prevent or exploit predicted outcomes. The establishment of specialized prophetic courts staffed by judges with training in divination theory provided forums for resolving disputes that involved prophetic knowledge, while ensuring that such sacred information would be handled with appropriate reverence and discretion. The development of prophetic privacy laws reflected growing understanding that knowledge of individual futures represented a form of personal information that required protection from unauthorized access or exploitation. The magical equivalent of medical confidentiality was extended to cover prophetic consultations, while new categories of protected information were created to prevent the misuse of prophetic knowledge for political manipulation, commercial advantage, or personal revenge. These legal frameworks acknowledged that prophecy represented a form of power that could be dangerous if not properly regulated and controlled. The transformation of magical law enforcement reflected lessons learned from the Wizarding Wars about the strategic value of prophetic intelligence and the dangers posed by those who sought to manipulate or suppress prophetic knowledge. Aurora training programs incorporated instruction in prophetic interpretation and verification, while specialized units were created to investigate crimes involving the theft, falsification, or misuse of prophetic materials. The protection of authentic seers became a priority for magical security services, who understood that such individuals represented valuable resources that required safeguarding from those who would exploit their abilities for destructive purposes. The impact on magical medicine included the development of specialized treatments for the unique psychological and physical conditions associated with prophetic ability, as healers recognized that seers required different forms of medical care than the general magical population. The establishment of prophetic health clinics provided services specifically designed for individuals who suffered from temporal displacement disorders, prophetic trauma, and the various forms of mental and physical exhaustion that accompanied authentic visionary experiences. These facilities became centers for research into the biological and psychological mechanisms underlying prophetic ability, while providing essential care for those whose service to the magical community came at enormous personal cost. The theological implications of proven prophecy forced magical religious communities to reconsider their understanding of divine intervention, cosmic purpose, and the relationship between mortal choice and supernatural guidance. The various magical faiths that had developed over centuries of wizarding civilization found themselves confronting evidence that some form of cosmic consciousness or divine intelligence was indeed active in shaping historical events through prophetic communication. The debates that emerged from these theological challenges influenced magical spiritual development in ways that extended far beyond formal religious institutions into the personal beliefs and practices of individual wizards throughout the formal world. The philosophical transformations that accompanied prophetic validation affected every aspect of magical intellectual life, from academic research to artistic expression to personal relationships between individuals who struggled to understand their place in patterns larger than their individual lives could encompass. The ancient debates between determinists who believed in fixed fate and libertarians who championed absolute free will gave way to more sophisticated understandings that recognized prophecy and choice as complementary rather than contradictory aspects of a cosmic reality that was both predetermined and creative, both inevitable and open to infinite possibility. The cultural impact of prophetic fulfillment influenced magical arts in ways both obvious and subtle. As writers, artists, musicians, and other creative individuals sought to process and express their understanding of events that had demonstrated the reality of forces operating beyond ordinary human experience. The literature that emerged from the post-war period reflected deep engagement with themes of destiny and choice, while magical theatrical productions explored the psychological and spiritual dimensions of living under prophetic influence. The development of new artistic forms specifically designed to capture and convey prophetic experiences created opportunities for seers to share their visions through media other than direct verbal communication. The social implications of validated prophecy affected relationships throughout magical society as individuals struggled to understand how knowledge of potential futures might influence their decisions about marriage, career, family planning, and other major life choices. The establishment of prophetic counseling services provided guidance for people who needed help interpreting prophetic information that affected their personal lives, while support groups offered community for those who felt isolated by their awareness of futures that others could not perceive or understand. The intergenerational effects of prophetic fulfillment were perhaps the most profound of all. As children who had grown up during the wars came of age in a world where prophecy was understood as authentic force rather than quaint superstition, this generation brought different assumptions and expectations to their adult lives. Their understanding of possibility and limitation shaped by childhood experiences of witnessing prophecy's power to influence historical events. Their approach to planning, risk assessment, and decision-making reflected integration of prophetic awareness, with practical considerations in ways that distinguished them from previous generations who had lived without such knowledge. The long-term implications for magical civilization remained to be seen, but early indicators suggested that the validation of prophecy would influence magical development in ways comparable to the discovery of new forms of magic or the establishment of new magical institutions. The understanding that some aspects of the future could be known in advance while others remained subject to individual choice created new possibilities for collective planning and social coordination, while raising new challenges about the proper balance between prophetic guidance and personal autonomy. The establishment of international prophetic monitoring systems created global networks for sharing information about visions that might affect multiple magical communities, while protocols for prophetic verification ensured that only authentic predictions would be treated as reliable intelligence. These systems represented unprecedented cooperation between magical governments and demonstrated how shared understanding of prophetic reality could overcome traditional barriers between nations and cultures that had previously limited international magical collaboration. As the magical world continued to process and adapt to the implications of proven prophecy, the ripple effects of these transformations continued to spread through every aspect of wizarding civilization, touching lives and shaping possibilities in ways both dramatic and subtle, creating new realities that reflected the eternal dance between destiny and choice that prophetic fulfillment had revealed as the fundamental rhythm of existence itself. Rest now, gentle dreamer, as our journey through the mystic realm of prophecy draws to its peaceful close. In these quiet hours, let yourself be comforted by the understanding that while prophecies may speak of predetermined paths, they also remind us that love, courage, and choice hold power beyond any foretold destiny. The seers who glimpsed tomorrow's shadows did so at great cost, their visions serving as both warning and hope for generations yet to come. As you drift towards sleep, know that somewhere in the magical world, the future whispers its secrets to those brave enough to listen, while the past's fulfilled prophecies stand as testament to the enduring power of free will within fate's grand design. Sweet dreams, and may your own tomorrow be written by wisdom, kindness, and the magic that lives within every choice you make.